If the most mythic stories in human culture are all about the hero's journey, then how about video games? Just how mythic and important can a video game's story be if we consider it as a piece of literature? Well, that's going to be one of the many very interesting things that I talk about with our guest on this episode. My guest is the translator Emily Jin, and we're going to be talking about the video game series Gujian, which are basically, to put it in like one phrase, Wuxia video games. Pretty exciting stuff, and a really interesting addition to our Wuxia season that we're currently doing on the show. But before we jump into the interview, it's time for the terrific news. So we have 3 items in the news today, and I've got them all open on little tabs on my browser, so I'll just go through them and quickly summarize them. So our first one is really interesting. It's an article that's up on the South China Morning Post, scmp.com, and it's an interview with an author who I've covered very early on this show. It's Murong Shuecun, the enfant terrible, I think that's how you say that, of Chinese literature, so they say. I covered his book, Leave Me Alone, on the show, and occasionally there's been mention of him since. There hasn't been mention of him for a while, so I'm glad I've got a chance to mention him again. So basically, it's an interview where he talks about various little things. I'll just go through the topics. So the first one is Frosty Beginnings, where he talks about his childhood and his family's roots in Dongbei in Manchuria, the northeast of China, the poverty he grew up with. He talks more about that poverty in the next bit, where he also gives the story of how he got into reading books and stories. Then he talks a little bit about his time in law school, then his entering, the section's called Labour Market, basically the first work he started doing. And if you've read Leave Me Alone, or if you've listened to my episode on it, you'll know that the world of white collar work is pretty much the setting of that book in China in the early 2000s. Next section is Internet Sensation. That's how he went on to become a famous author via web publishing. I guess we shouldn't say web novels, because that would imply, like, based on the last few episodes, you'd think I was talking about wuxia and crazy genre fiction. But he was publishing more like realistic fiction on the web, as you'll know if you've read the book or if you've listened to my episode. So yeah, after that, we've got his story of how he was published, how he was found in translation. This is interesting because I was always curious about the publishing house and the guy, Harvey Tomlinson, who is based out in Hong Kong. He's the guy that brought Murong into English translation. So that was interesting. Then Murong talks about a trip with his publisher, his English language publisher, to the UK and the things he did in the UK. I was quite surprised what Murong got up to. You can read the article and find out. And then the end of the article is perhaps the meat, where he talks about being a dissident writer of sorts and how he's tried to secure his freedom of speech as best he can, even though it's getting harder and harder. And last of all, he kind of talks about things in the context of the COVID outbreak that started in Wuhan and is now everywhere. So yeah, fantastic article, and really nice to know that Murong's still keeping busy and is still in contact with English language publications. Next little news item, it's a book this time, or at least a blog about a book. I saw this on Twitter, thought it was a cool thing to bring up. So it's an article on the website of Andrew Batson, who seems to be a fellow who blogs about Chinese things and books. And the book he's blogged about is Land Wars, the story of China's agrarian revolution. And he's just written kind of a little summary with some quotes from it. And he focuses on one of the characters of, well, I say characters, it's non-fiction, but one of the big figures in the book, Xi Zhongsun, who is current Chinese President Xi Jinping's father, because Xi Zhongsun was involved in the land reforms, but as was revealed in some documents, which were originally only for internal distribution in one of the Chinese defense universities, the documents basically, one of the things that is in there is records of Xi Zhongsun pushing back against the kind of more radical or violent plans for land reform. So basically, a bit of a ideological is maybe a grandiose word, but a clash of sorts between Xi Zhongsun, so Xi Jinping's father, and Mao, Chairman Mao Zedong. So juicy stuff, I suppose. I will link to that blog in the show notes, and you can check out the book online. Okay, last news item. This is not exactly hot off the press, but worth covering now. So the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature has announced its nominees for its 2021 prize. It's every 2 years that this prize is awarded, so I guess the nominees have been announced ahead of time. I'll link to the post that where this was announced, but let's just go through the nominees and who nominated them. So Shu Xiaobin was nominated by Chen Xiaoming, Long Yingtai was nominated by Aileen Chao, Su Tong was nominated by Huang Yunte, Wu He was nominated by Andrea Bachner, and Yan Lianke was nominated by Eric Abrahamson. So how does that relate to the show? Well, aside from being about Chinese literature, we covered Su Tong. We looked at his Petunia's Rouge Tin, and the episode I did with Anya Goncharova, formerly of Penguin China, now with Peony Literary Agency. And Eric Abrahamson is a former guest on the show. He was on the show to talk with me about Gilfay's Flock of Brown Birds. Nice to see familiar names. That is all the items we've got for our Terrific news. Before we get on with the episode, I'm just going to take a chance to talk about the show's Patreon, because I normally talk about this at the end of the show when the end music starts, and I figured some people might be tuning out. So essentially, you know how Patreon works, I'm sure. You give a little bit of money to the show, i.e. me, every month. The minimum amount is $1, and that will get you access to lots of different bonus shows. So there's hours and hours of stuff up there. Most of the bonus shows, all bar 2, are me on my own. So if you like the solo shows, which I don't do very many of these days, and you want more, there's some stuff up there. I do mix it up on the Patreon. So I cover non-fiction stuff. I cover stuff not written. Stuff written in English, not translated from Chinese. For example, I did a little overview of a book called The Greeks in Asia. The book was about the ancient Greeks, everywhere from Persia through to India. But I looked at the it's for the most interesting part for me, certainly, but the most relevant to the podcast, ancient Greek cultural exchange, actual and theorized with China, with the particular dynasties of the time. Another one I did, kind of probably outside the remit of a normal show episode that I looked at, was I looked at Cat Country by Lao She, and I compared that with a Japanese kind of modern fiction classic, I Am a Cat. So I did like a cat versus cat, China versus Japan thing. So if you like fun stuff like that and you'd like to support the show, that's the Patreon. Not going to do this for many episodes, but I just thought it would be good to get a little bit of this promo at the front. Now I will stop babbling and let's hear my chat with Emily Jin. I'm sure you'll be entertained by it because it was a really fun chat to have. So I've got Emily Jin on the show. Hi Emily, how's it going over there?
Hello, it's going great. So I'm speaking from my home in Beijing at the moment. This is still part of my summer break at the moment, and it's great to be talking to you and to people about my favorite game.
Yeah, we're here to talk about, Gujian 3 / kind of all the Gujian games. But before we talk about what the game is, can you tell the listeners a wee bit about yourself or your journey as a translator? And I guess if there's like a saga of how you first discovered Gujian, you could tell that too.
All right, so as I mentioned, summer break just now, so I'm currently a PhD student at Yale University, Department of East Asian Languages and Literature. So that's kind of my actual main, I guess, quote unquote, job at the moment. But I think as people kind of know me online, I'm also a translator. I mostly translate science fiction and fantasy. So I do translation both ways, from Chinese into English and English into Chinese. So that's kind of the two big things about me at the moment as a person. But it's cool because this time I get to talk not just about, I guess, job and academics, but also about like this major hobby of mine, which is I do gaming a lot. And Gujian is definitely one of, I would even say, kind of one of the most serious RPG games that kind of got me into gaming at all. There's 3 games to this whole series, and the first one came out in 2010, and that's also the year when I discovered it. So I think I was maybe back in high school. I was in high school at that time, and when it came out, I kind of was very into the aesthetics in general and bought the game. I think back then was when you used to have to actually buy the game, and you can't just download it. So I bought it and immediately got myself immersed into the world. and all just kind of carried on from there. And it's been 10 years already, actually. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of Gujian on July 10th. So that's literally just like a week ago.
Yeah, I remember back in 2010, for the first ever time I bought a game. Well, wasn't the first time I bought a game, but I bought a game. It came in a box, and there was no disc in the box. It was a download code. So I guess that was around the time when that transition was happening. I guess we should specify for the listeners, Gujian is a Wuxia game, which makes sense that we're covering it because we're in this podcast Wuxia season. So before we get into like what makes Gujian Wuxia, could you just describe what it is for any listeners who haven't heard of it?
Well, so I think the official description to it would kind of be it's this classic RPG game where I think we have to note that I know that right now when we think of RPG, we think of, let's say, Diablo, where you go into the game, you kind of like roam around the map freely and you just kind of kill monsters everywhere. But I think back in 2010, that was when you still kind of take rounds to like throw magic at the monsters and like, I don't know, like hit the monsters while you're in the game. So you definitely are more restrained while playing. But I think to me, Gujian, definitely it's pretty classic, I guess, at least in the Chinese gaming history of how it's built, how the story is told, how it's programmed, how the engine works. But the way it stands out is that it really embodies both the wuxia narrative tradition by, I guess, following one or two protagonists that kind of go on a journey and slowly upgrade themselves. But also Gujian does mythology really well. I think it's very active in incorporating a lot of elements from multiple sources of Chinese mythology, as well as a lot of ancient texts and traditional culture. I would say it's a very quote unquote cultured game, if I could call it that.
Yeah, what you said about the difference between games where a character roams around and in their fights, you know, they move in 3D space in real time versus the other style of RPG games where fights are done turn by turn. Like the games I've played in the RPG genre are more in like the former style, although I can think of a game I've played in the latter style, the turn-based one. And just to be clear, now, I know Gujian 3 it's not, the fighting is real time. It's not taking turns. And I know Gujian 1, because I watched some playthroughs, that's a turn-based one. I don't know about the second game. Is the fighting in Gujian 2 also taking turns?
Oh, it's actually really interesting because you can really see how the programming is like upgrading throughout how the game is developing, because the first one is definitely still taking turns and it's like very strictly like closed map, turn-based fighting. But in Gujian 2, when you get into like, let's say a boss fight, they kind of pull you into this map zone where it's just you and the boss kind of in your little space fighting. And while you're in that space, you're kind of fighting freely and kind of not. You're kind of like in between. And when you get to Gujian 3, it's completely just like open map. So I think for, I guess, players who have really followed this game from the beginning can see how the company's been improving in making their games more and more, I guess, we call it like advanced, more playable. And I think definitely Gujian 3's free map attract a lot of people to just kind of try it out, because I think even my friends who are used to playing more, I guess, like Blizzard-like games, when they tried Gujian 3, they were just like, oh, okay, like the graphics are nice. The way that the fighting structure is like what I'm used to. It's no longer, I guess like in the sense of playing, it's no longer quote unquote boring. Because I think some people, when they first see Gujian 1, they would say it's more on the boring side because the fighting isn't exactly exciting. It's more kind of like strategic, where you have to plan like what kind of magic you use, what kind of power you use, and you kind of like also use potions in between. It's more like planning out beforehand what to do, and people are there more for the storyline and more for the world exploration. But when you get to Gujian 3, people are definitely more immersed into the actual fighting, and I think that's something that attracted a lot of people just because of the way it's played.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can help me with this one, but when I was reading some like comments and reviews about the Gujian games. I think I saw some commenters comparing it to Final Fantasy, and I've never played a Final Fantasy game. I have some vague memories of watching someone play it, and I think the fighting in those ones was turn-based. And I remember some of the visuals in what I remember remind me now of some of the visuals from Gujian 3. So I don't know what answer I'm expecting here, but have you ever played any of those Final Fantasy games? And do you know if they're at all an influence or in any way related to Gujian?
This I'm not exactly sure about. I have played Final Fantasy, but I think I was just mostly more into Final Fantasy 14, which is the online one.
Right.
That's obviously different from its turn-based classic RPG games, but I wouldn't be surprised if it has been kind of a source of influence on Chinese games in general, because I think a lot of the game makers who right now, even just the general team for Gujian, I think it's mostly people who are born in the 80s, and it makes a lot of sense that I think the Japanese gaming culture and Japanese animation culture in general have had like a huge influence on them. So I wouldn't be surprised if Final Fantasy was like a source of inspiration. I know that Elder Scrolls influenced Gujian quite a lot.
Right.
That came from an interview, but I don't really know about the Japanese side.
Right. This is going to sound like a really superficial comment, but a thing I noticed a little bit in Gujian 3, but maybe more in Gujian, the gameplay I watched of Gujian 1 and 2, the characters had hairstyles, especially the male characters had these hairstyles that were almost as crazy as or fantastical as some of the ones you'd see in like a Japanese anime or a game, but a lot more subtle and maybe equally related to the kind of traditional hairstyles you'd see in a Chinese historical drama. So yeah, when I was watching the gameplay, I was seeing a little bit of both in my mind's eye. But yeah, there's no question there. And before I get bogged down in haircuts, here's the next question. So going back to those fan comments or people commenting on Gujian that I saw online, I saw people not arguing, but kind of nitpicking or looking for evidence or points as to whether the Gujian games would be better described as Wuxia, as we've kind of been talking about them, or Xianxia, which is kind of like Wuxia's fantasy cousin genre, which I talked a lot about with the translator Deathblade 2 episodes ago. And 1 episode ago, we were looking at Xianxia's story, Necropolis Immortal. So if listeners want more detail about that term, they can look at those past 2 episodes. But for now, I guess we could say Wuxia's the more grounded, less magical or not magical genre. Xianxia is more, I don't know, what can we say? Just fantastical, more magic, more of like heavenly realms than the earthly realm, more attached to fantasy than Chinese history, but equally influenced by it. So yeah, is Gujian one or the other, or is that a completely kind of false dilemma? Is that the wrong way to think about it?
I think first of all, I think it's a great way to connect your episodes together. I think it's really smart.
Thanks.
As for Gujian, actually, because ever since you kind of mentioned this idea to me, I've also been going over whether it's more Wuxia or Xianxia, because I think in my own recognition, I think Xianxia points to more of a narrower sense of storytelling. I think in Xianxia, it's where I guess the magic or quote unquote the xian part takes up most of, I guess if you translate it into gaming language, it would be like the primary part of your upgrading your system, all of your like magic and everything. But in Gujian, it's kind of torn apart because the storyline, the setting, and the world, I think it's definitely more on the Wuxia side. Most of the towns you pass through, most of the people you meet, most of the story that's happening around you, it's definitely very kind of traditional Wuxia. And I think Gujian actually has been praised by its fans for being this game that's deeply rooted in actual Chinese history. And even though it doesn't necessarily always specify a dynasty or anything, it still kind of points to a lot of historical references. Sometimes even just like historical figures come into the game to kind of interact with you. For example, Gujian 2 especially, the major city, Chang'an, is as we can all tell, it's based on the Tang Dynasty capital. And one of the characters in the game, which is also someone you can play, his surname is Li, and he's also like a prince from the palace court. So you can definitely draw that connection and understand where this game is going for, even though it doesn't really specify that it's about the Tang Dynasty. So I think all these details make Gujian a game that's very strongly ingrained in reality. But at the same time, I think just to take care of the gaming aspect, I think when you actually fight and everything, to just make the visuals cool, to make kind of like to hook the players, Gujian also incorporated a lot of magic in general into the fighting system. So I think to me, when I was playing, I kind of looked at the game, the storytelling and world building as a separate thing from the fighting system. Right. Because I guess in a game, you can't just go around just, I guess, like Wuxia, swing your swords and just cutting down people, because that obviously would make the game a lot more boring than if you had like elements and magic and all these kind of like in, let's say, the whole way you improve and upgrade and cultivate in this Xianxia system. Yeah. So I guess that's my take on either side that Gujian is on. I can't really decide, but I guess like because of the degree of magic and also mythology in the game, if you want to count it as Xianxia, it would also kind of make some sense. I don't know. I think I'd see it more as a mixture between, let's say, maybe 70% reality and 30% mythology that's very kind of like savvily incorporated. Is that in a word, savvily? That's like incorporated into the game.
Yeah, I think that's a viable adverb. Yeah. A thing I noticed even from the word go doing this interview was, although in my mind literature is supposedly more complicated than video games, I'm finding it harder to talk about this game than I usually do a story or a book. Maybe I'm just not used to it. And I think that would make sense when we're trying to pick apart games, Xianxia and Wuxia, because although I'm certainly not an expert of any of those three things, as I've been doing a little bit of reading and research for this Wuxia season of episodes that I've been doing, I think one thing at least what I'm seeing is that Wuxia is, although it got its kind of inauguration as a genre in the 20th century, it has roots in older literature going back to, I think, about the Tang Dynasty based on my, very extensive Wikipedia reading. Whereas the vibe I get from Xianxia, although it maybe has some roots or inspirations from Chinese traditions, like the pursuit of immortality or what have you, it seems like its kind of foundation is leveling up and video games. So yeah, like it seems like a more of a digital genre despite having kind of cultural or ancient cultural roots. So when we're talking about a game which is drawing from two genres which exist as literature, but one of which kind of is it's more of a game in itself, I can already feel my mind getting wrapped up in, everything getting tied in knots. So continuing the kind of thread of the grounded setting and the magical setting, I'd like to ask you about the settings in the game, the earthly setting and the heavenly setting. Although actually before I do that, I want to sneak in a question that's not in our little list here, because you mentioned Chang'an and you said obviously that's the amazing capital of the Tang Dynasty, but just for any listeners who are not familiar with Chang'an, like I wasn't not so long ago, I wonder if we could talk a wee bit about some of why that's such a awesome setting for a game. And the reason it's on my mind is I watched a film not so long ago. Its English name is Legend of the Demon Cat. Its Chinese name is Bao Ma Zhuan. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have seen it.
And I got the feeling as I was watching it, the whole point of this film was to showcase Chang'an in all its amazingness. So although there is magic in the movie, I felt like the point was the earthly setting. So you might, I don't know, I feel like you probably do a better job than me. What's so rich about the setting of Chang'an and the Tang Dynasty? So
this is quite a big question, and I guess the way I'll talk about it is that I'll try to combine it with what's happening in Gujian specifically to kind of illustrate what really Chang'an as a city means both historically and also symbolically. So just to give a little bit of context, like Angus said before, Chang'an is the capital of the Tang Dynasty, which essentially makes it kind of the hub of exchange, the hub of riches, is where everyone goes, and it's where basically all the cool things happen. And because I think people now, even just writers and creators, and like you said, movie makers, people who grew up immersed in Chinese culture tend to have this kind of longing, this kind of sense of admiration towards Tang Dynasty, because it's always portrayed through history books as perhaps one of the most kind of one of the strongest periods.
Like culturally rich and cosmopolitan. Maybe that's a good word for Chang'an and the Tang Dynasty. Like going off what you said, a thing that, so I would have had no reason to disbelieve this, but having like, you know, grown up in Scotland, going through a fairly broad education system, but definitely like a Eurocentric one, not maliciously so. If someone had asked me like, what have the greatest cities in world history been, my answers would have been, oh, maybe like Athens or Rome. But then doing like basic reading about Chang'an, you learn pretty quickly it was the most populous city in the world. Reading up a bit more, I learned just how far different people were going to get to Chang'an and Tang Dynasty China to kind of emulate its culture. Like a parallel in Europe might be the Romans trying to emulate Greece, or people after the fall of Rome trying to emulate the olden world that had preceded them. And in this movie that I mentioned, Legend of the Demon Cat, that's kind of the instigation of the plot. It's a visitor from Japan, a monk who's trying to learn a little bit about, I think, the theology or the texts in Chang'an. And the book it's actually based on is a Japanese book. So it's a modern example of people from outside China's borders looking into this amazing cultural hub. So yeah, I've forgotten exactly where you left off, but I think what we're trying to say is that it was in world history, not just Chinese history. Chang'an is an amazing place, and the Tang Dynasty was an amazing period in Asia, I guess.
Right, and yes, just kind of thank you for helping me find my language. I think just carrying off of what you said just now, I think the way that Chang'an has gained its significance in especially art and literature, that people are essentially piling all their fantasies about the Tang Dynasty onto Chang'an, and really they're imagined as a hub, not just for people from all across the reality world, but also a hub where fantasy can happen. So it's really just not a city just for travelers, for the ordinary and the rich people. It's also a place for all kinds of demons and monsters and people who are involved in the Jianghu, the Wuxia world, where it's the place where everyone wants to be. And so if you move that setting into Gujian as a game, you can kind of see why it's special, because Chang'an is actually the first major city we encounter as we enter the world of Gujian 2 especially. And as a background, so actually the involvement of the royal family is actually a pretty big part of the Gujian 2 plot, where one of the main characters that you can play, like I said before, he's also from the royal family. So you get to see his backstory, you get to see why he needs to kind of travel the world and find certain things to help him kind of get the throne out and all of that. So he's the main person in charge of opening up the entire Chang'an / royal family plotline. And I think what really made me feel the power of Chang'an visually was that kind of imagine you open up the game and kind of just trying things around, and immediately you kind of leave your home base, and the first major city that's just kind of like falling upon you is Chang'an. It's that sudden sense of like, wow, this is very overwhelming, because I think also given the game's past history, Gujian 2 is where the visuals kind of made a leap, and you can definitely see how the visuals are a lot better than Gujian 1. And so for someone who's followed the game all along, you're just very shocked and also just very happy of how this game has evolved to be. So I think for me, that personal sense of involvement, that sense of seeing your favorite kind of like game gradually grow better and better, that combined with kind of like, I guess like, to be frank, what I felt back then was just kind of like, wow, like they even dared to like make a channel in the game at all, because the city is huge and they really try to follow the historical map and the way they kind of put markets, the way they put historical buildings, the way they even just like send NPCs all around the city. They've like kind of tried their best to make it as historically based as possible. And
Yeah.
I definitely remember myself spending a lot of time just roaming around the city and talking to people and looking at corners of the city, and they like just paid massive attention to details. And I think for me, just having the chance to control this character who's not even playing the game, who's just walking around the city that I have personally admired so much or imagined so much, is already in itself a unique experience.
Yeah. What you said about the kind of leap in graphics from Gujian 1 to 2. So when I was watching the gameplay, I could kind of see that so Gujian 3 looks fantastic. It's a beautiful game. Gujian 1, as I watched a minute or two of it, my feeling was it seems like it's a labor of love, because it didn't seem up to par with like the top of the range international games that would have been coming out at the same time. But I could see like it was, maybe I'm assuming here, but I got the feeling that this was a very unique game because it was a RPG made in China, probably I guess, yeah, it only had the Chinese language. I think only Gujian 3 has got other languages built in. Gujian 3's got English subs. So for I guess for people in China or in the Chinese diaspora, it's a game, I guess there are other games with Chinese settings, but not made in China. And a thing I learned in my research is, like, these days, a lot of the big Chinese-made games, even now, are either mobile games or online games. So the idea of having like a fully fleshed out PC or console game made in China, about China or drawing from Chinese culture, is a special thing. And although this isn't like a perfect analogy, I feel like being from not America, I have a little bit of a similar feeling when a really good British film comes out, or even better for me, a really good Scottish film, because just in the world of pop culture, when you're a smaller country, or even if you're a country which isn't small, but doesn't have the kind of cultural industry that can compete with, Hollywood or Silicon Valley, it's kind of special when you see something that reflects yourself. When we were talking way back with initial ideas for this episode, I mentioned a game called Fable, which was made. I can't remember the name of the company. And the Fable sequels they took an opposite trajectory from Gujian. They got worse. But the first Fable game was a fantastic little thing for the Xbox. It wasn't set in a real world, but it was set in a fantasy world called Albion, which is an old name for I think Britain. I think it's a Celtic name for Britain. But it was kind of like full of anachronisms. There were lots of characters with different modern accents from the different regions, and it had like a very British sense of humor to it. So it was a nice change from games where everyone sounds like this, where everyone's like, even I remember games like Halo where you're fighting in the United World Army. Mysteriously, everyone is American. It was just a nice change from that sort of world. I think I've got completely lost. Oh yeah, the point was about why it was maybe special for people to be playing in Chang'an. I guess there's no question here I can ask except am I more or less right that it was nice to have something familiar and yet different from the usual offering of video games?
Actually, I think I would kind of disagree on this one. So to give a little more context, I think the time that Gujian came out, Gujian is not the first game like this in its kind. Way before Gujian, I would say the beginning of this is 仙剑奇侠传, if you've heard of the name.
I was reading something about a parallel game. It had the English name. The English name was Paladin. Let me try and look this up.
Yeah, I think that's it. I don't remember exactly what the game was, but it's something Paladin.
Yeah, that would be the one. Yeah.
So I think that's actually the classic of the classic, which came out super early. And I think while that came out, a bunch of other RPG games solely based on Jin Yong's Wuxia novels also came out. So I think that was way back in, let's say, 2003 maybe. And that was when I think obviously the technology was not as advanced. And I think people, back then people were really just interested in wow, like people are making games based on Chinese culture at all. And I would say that those games were the first batch of games, RPG games based on Chinese culture / literature. And I think the commonality is that they both kind of take the setting of either just Jin Yong's wuxia world directly. Let's say, I think during that time, a lot of games were definitely made based on the, what do you call it? The Condor Heroes.
Legend of the
So
Condor Heroes is the,
yeah.
I guess that's the book series has taken that name, and that's based on the official translation of the TV show's name.
Okay, so I think a lot of games were definitely based on that worldview, where you just follow one of Jin Yong's characters and experience what kind of they experienced in the books. So that's kind of one line of popular RPG games. And the other line is what I mentioned just now, the Paladin game, the Xianxia. So Xianxia takes place more in, it's definitely more on the fantasy side. I think a lot of the places in the games and a lot of the people involved, they're more obviously on the Xianxia side, where I think in one of the, because Xianxia also is a series, so I think they went up till maybe 6, and now they kind of like stopped-ish. But they were the hype before Gujian came along. And like I said before, they're more on the Xianxia side in the sense that they've involved more magic. I think they definitely made up more fictional places, and it's not so much based on history or mythology. But then I think to me, Gujian is a mixture of kind of both of the games, and it's unique in the sense that on one hand, I think it really captures the groundedness, and it really roots itself in just culture and history. And I think one part that I especially appreciate Gujian about is when you do the gameplay, there's kind of like a separate bonus mission as you go through the game, where you actually just go into all the cities and you talk to people and you explore. And as you talk, people kind of tell you snippets about history and culture, and you collect those quote unquote special terms. And you kind of like have a separate little like glossary on your dashboard, where you can actually go back and check what terms you've collected. And each of the terms is something that's unique about the city you're in or the time period, or explain something. So even just through playing the game, it's actually rather like educational, that I found myself learning history and learning about, let's say, Chang'an City while I'm in the game. So Gujian really did pay a lot of attention to promoting the historical aspect of things. So I think I would just put it simply that Gujian has a lot more educational value. And I think it's definitely very aware on getting people to know what the mechanisms are in their inspirations of making the game like this. And you can kind of even see through the game that the main kind of storytelling team is trying to get people interested in looking at the culture and history and mythology behind just the game playing itself. So even though some people would say that Gujian, especially Gujian 1, is more or less boring compared to its counterparts, others really do enjoy just the feeling of not having to rush to boss fights or missions and having the chance to really just stay in the cities and actually valuing exploration as a thing. Because I know that in other games, I have friends who would just rather like to rush through and would like to just kind of like only do the fights and pick up the treasure and don't really care about the city setting. But Gujian, with its little bonus mission of picking up the glossary, people actually now have to take the time in collecting stuff and doing that and getting to know their setting. So I think that's one thing they do best. And I think a lot of people gradually saw this as their specialty, and people are just kind of more and more drawn to the game because of that. And I think just one last fun fact is that actually the team that made Gujian 1 at least came from the Xianjian team. So after making, I think, Xianjian 4 maybe, a bunch of their team quit that and then made a new company, which is what eventually ended up becoming the company that made Gujian. So in essence, they kind of have the same mother, but went two different directions.
Right, same kind of family tree. What you were saying about kind of enjoying just being in the setting, like being in the world, is, I guess, on one hand, that's something all RPGs offer in a way, but some more than others. A thing I noticed both playing Gujian 3 and watching the playthroughs of Gujian 1 and 2, something they all had in common I noticed was really nice music and just a kind of really nice ambiance. Like there were bits where I guess whoever was playing in the playthroughs had just left the keyboard. They were AFK, as they say, but it was all right because they were standing in a nice part of the map and there was nice music playing, and it was reminding me of again, this was something Fable had going for it, nice music where it was pleasant to, just like it's pleasant in life to be going for a stroll, not really doing anything. It was pleasant in when I was playing Gujian 3 to just be walking through a setting. So I guess speaking of settings and enjoying them, and Gujian 3 in particular, at least in the early parts of Gujian 3, I found that there were, well, I didn't find it. I experienced the two kind of main settings of the game. I think the most concise way to describe them would be like there's an earthly setting and then there's a heavenly setting. The earthly setting is where people like me and you live, and the heavenly setting is the land of the immortals, or as they're called in Gujian 3, at least in the English subs, the Fae. And the main character is kind of torn between the two worlds. I guess that's the thing driving his character dynamic in the plot. And I thought they were both really interesting. The heavenly realm, it's kind of like a city, and its name in the English subs is Sky Elk, so an interesting name. And it had like design elements. I was seeing design elements from all over the place. There was definitely a lot of Chinese design going on. Like the rooms in the buildings were reminding me of ancient Chinese buildings I'd been in. But they kind of the roofs and the walls of the buildings, some of them looked like they were from classical European capitals. Some of the I don't know what you call them, the peaks or the ceilings looked pointy in the way that buildings in Thailand or Southeast Asia were. So there's all these seamless fusions going on, and the characters walking around Sky Elk had all these different, very subtly blended costumes. They had different hair colors. So it was like this thing you wouldn't ever see on Earth, but clearly influenced by Earth. And then down on the ground in the earthly setting, it felt much more like a jump back to reality. The landscape looked a lot like Guilin or Guizhou or somewhere in southern China, and the people were very kind of grounded. They were practicing sword fighting or tai chi or something. The music became a lot more down to earth, and I really felt, okay, I've been doing lots of fighting up in the heavenly realm. Now I just want to walk around and explore this incredibly realized world. So I guess my question is, if you've played much of Gujian 3, do you have a favorite setting in the game? And could you easily say whether it's the earth or the heavens?
I think in this one, I do agree that I think not just me, but a lot of other players noticed immediately that the heavenly setting, it resembles a lot of again, I think that actually felt very Final Fantasy-ish to me.
Right.
As I jumped the heavenly setting, the Sky Elk City, it definitely seemed a lot more European, or it definitely seemed like a city taken out from, let's say, some kind of anonymous game that's based in Europe, let's say, instead of in Gujian, that I think a lot of the fans didn't expect to see the first major city to be like this. And I think there were some discussions actually just based around what the city looked like. And what I could gather is that they kind of purposely made the city like this first to kind of test out their new graphics.
Totally.
Kind of be like, okay, we're now kind of sick of the traditional Chinese aesthetics. Now we're going to try for a new look and see if it works or not. This is the first part. And the second part is definitely to draw a difference between the Sky Elk people and the mortals, which, like you said before, is one of the main conflicts of the plot surrounding our protagonist. So I think they wanted to make Sky Elk as different as possible visually from the earthly realm. So people would just be like, oh, wow, okay, like now I'm certainly in a different world.
Yeah.
And to just really re-emphasize this otherworldliness of the Sky Elk City and its people. And actually, is now the time to kind of go off a little bit about Sky Elk as a term, or should we continue later as we talk about?
Because I already
Okay.
did that. I jumped ahead asking you about your history with the game. So yeah, who cares?
Okay.
Let's jump on that now, and then if there's more to say later, we can come back to it. If there's nothing else to say, it's fine.
Okay, great. So I think regarding Skylock, I think the first impression that I got while I saw the Skylock people was I don't know if you remember, but the first woman character who came out, the protagonist's brother's wife, if you remember.
Yep.
So I think she's the person who had very light hair,
Yeah.
and she looked kind of European. So I think when she appeared on screen for the first time, I was like, oh wow, she now definitely she looks like someone from Final Fantasy. And I think to me it was weird at first to kind of hear her speaking Chinese and how she had obviously like a Chinese name and she's incorporated into the mythology and all that. So I think that to me was a bit awkward, but later on I kind of just accepted that. Like I said just now, going off a little bit about Skyhawk. So because I've played Chinese version, so I know that the Skyhawk is just a rough translation. It's a direct translation of the Chinese title, which is Tianlu. So
Tianlu.
Tian
Okay.
literally means sky and Lu is elk. So
Well,
I
can
think in
Lu
the
also be deer though,
Mhm.
right? They could have called it like heaven deer or sky deer, or is Lu specifically elk?
You're right. Lu is kind of elk, deer-ish, like that creature. But I kind of understand why they made it sky elk instead of sky deer or whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Is
sky
that
deer sounds awful.
I mean, even the Chinese name itself, it's actually not about heavenly deers. So I don't know if you got to the part where you get to see the kind of the real monster form of the Skylock people.
I remember I watched on YouTube. I watched some kind of a boss battle, and yeah, now that I think about it, it was one of the Fae. The Fae in the Chinese. Well, I say in the Chinese. The game, the version, the English version is Chinese dialogue with English subs. I just wasn't listening very closely to the Chinese dialogue. Is the name Fae? Is that just Xian in the Chinese?
I think that's probably just Xian. Xian or Yao. I couldn't quite tell.
Okay. So if I'll just say Fei or Xian and treat it as interchangeable. Okay. So yeah, one of the Xian guys who I think was set up as a baddie in the early game, which I was playing, I skipped ahead to watch the boss battles, and I think it was him transforming into this like horrifying demonic deer-like thing. But I didn't realize that's what they're all like. That's a bit freaky.
So that's so that's actually their I guess their real body. And I think even just the term Sky Elk is actually a metaphor because their race, I guess their quote unquote Fey race in the game is actually called 辟邪 in Chinese. And that's a mythological reference. 辟邪 is creature that's modeled based on somewhat like elk, deer-ish, and also somewhat lion, dog-ish. It's a combination of kind of like big animals that can hurt you. And anything 辟邪 translates into kind of like purging evil spirits. That's the literal translation.
Right.
So it's this guardian of, so it's portrayed as a guardian creature, and it's supposed to be very good at fighting, and it's also supposed to be very kind of like, I guess, just like exuding light in general, that it kind of fights against darkness and all of that. Even now in Chinese culture, the figure of beast is sometimes used in temples, also sometimes made into like little sculptures. People wear them to kind of protect themselves. So it's definitely seen as a guardian monster in mythology.
Right. I guess for listeners, I'll try and find some articles or pictures related to Bixia and put them in the show notes for you guys. Because sounds really interesting, but obviously in the medium of audio, all we can do is, I say all we as if I would know what I was talking about, but all we can do is describe them. So yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners. Last night when I was kind of thinking, wait, is there anything else I can do to kind of, any talking points I can prepare in my head for this episode? And then I thought about the Skyhawk, the heavenly setting in Gujian 3, and I thought, okay, so it's got some kind of fusion of quote unquote like China or / Asia and Europe of the past, or kind of, it's timeless in a way because it seems more modern than the earthly world below. So I was thinking, what games have I played that have done that have some kind of a fusion of, in little quote marks, East and West? And the one that maybe it's because I've not played enough Japanese games, just the ones that everyone else my age has played. But the Pokemon games, at least the first, I played the first 3 gens, and I guess maybe the TV show as well. They have a modern setting, but I guess especially I remember watching the TV show thinking, oh yeah, all these characters have American accents. They seem to live a life somewhat similar to mine. Plus, they have Pokemon in their world, obviously. In my life, I have no such thing. But then occasionally something would slip through, like the characters would be celebrating Children's Day, or everyone would start waving fans to cheer someone on, or they'd approach a temple. And in the game, there were some similar things like that, where it would just seem quote unquote normal, but then something that hadn't been adapted or modified to make it westernized would appear. And I guess that's really different from the setting of Skyel, where everything is kind of, at least the architecture and, like you were saying, some of the characters' appearances are fused. And yeah, maybe the weirdest thing about it is that people who look like they couldn't possibly be Chinese or have Chinese names. But yeah, I don't really have a question there. That was just the thing that had been floating in my head when you were talking about that. So yeah, I'll just move on to the next question. It's about some listener feedback I got from I think either when we were covering Jin Yong's A Hero Born, the first part of Legend of the Condor Heroes, or possibly when we were covering Gulong's 7 Killers with Deathblade. A guy on Twitter called Edmund He gave me some of his thoughts on the wuxia genre, and it was relating to like the themes of power and responsibility. And he gave a shot at compare and contrasting power and responsibility in like classic wuxia and power and responsibility in the Marvel and DC world. So maybe using like those American superheroes as a stand-in for like a quote unquote Western view of power and responsibility. And his thinking was that in the superhero stories from America, power comes before responsibility. So not to say that power is more important, but the characters in those stories, first they become very strong, and then they learn to use that strength responsibly. And Edmund He's thinking was in wuxia, characters are trying to act responsibly first, and along the way they kind of pick up some power. And that definitely is an accurate description of Condor Heroes. It didn't really describe 7 Killers. In 7 Killers, it seemed like everyone was very powerful and no one really cared too much about being responsible. So I wonder, does his kind of formulation describe the characters' journeys in Gujian in any of the 3 games at all? I don't know. I don't know because I haven't played the games apart from the start of number 3. I was wondering would you know about that?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think when you were talking just now, I think I also was going through all the 3 games in my heart and kind of looking at the stories. So I think if we draw our attention to, I think, Gujian 3 at first, it's interesting because to some extent it does follow the classic wuxia trope where the character is kind of weak at first and then receives some kind of responsibility, which to our protagonist is kind of gradually realizing that he's responsible for his city, for the Skylark people. And because he's been raised as well, just as background, he's been raised as a mortal growing up and not actually raised in Skylark City, where his twin brother has always kind of been the king of Skylarks and has been the one who's protected the realm and kind of fulfilled the duty. And in the end, when our protagonist realizes that his brother can no longer be that strong figure, he really had to take a step forward and carry this responsibility. But for a very long time in the game, our character kind of he was neither strong or responsible. So he kind of like spent the first few hours of the game just roaming around, doing whatever he likes, spending time with the earthly people and kind of living his life. And in essence, really not caring at all about whatever's happening around him. He's just so normal to the point that he like doesn't seem like your regular protagonist.
Yeah, at that point in the game, I remember I was fighting monkeys in the apple orchard.
Right. And that's kind of what he like only cared about. He just wanted to be normal. And he really had no aspirations whatsoever. So I think in the beginning, he's portrayed as this kind of anti-hero even.
Yeah, because he's wearing black and his brother's wearing white.
Exactly. And I think whatever made him more interesting is that I think this struggle, this growth is not just linear. It's not just kind of one-sided about how he realizes and then kind of practices harder to acquire more power and to fulfill his duty. But because of his kind of double identity as both someone who's kind of always identified himself with the mortal people and as a kind of royal-born sky elk, there's always been this inherent struggle within him that it's not like he can't acquire that power. He just kind of refuses to embrace his way more powerful Fey side of his identity. So I think a huge part of the acquisition of power in Gujian 3 especially is not just about practicing getting better whatsoever. It's also about kind of this internal journey where the protagonist has to realize first that he actually wants and needs the power that's built within him, and to really kind of reconcile with not just his brother that he's been very strange to his whole life, but also his kind of family line, his history, his past, and to accept the fact that he can't just be an ordinary mortal. So I think that took up a large part of the inner narrative of the story of Gujian 3. So I think that's one thing. And let me just kind of shift gears for a bit and turn to Gujian 1. And the reason I'm just picking out these two and not Gujian 2 is that I think as I'm talking, I realize how Gujian 2 it's more or less, I guess, normal in the sense that I think Gujian 2 is the one that really follows the classical kind of Wuxia idea, that people can easily kind of recognize the Gujian 2 characters in the classic Wuxia novels. But Gujian 1 is especially interesting and different, and it's actually, story-wise, it's my favorite one because I think it's actually the reverse. To me, I think Gujian 1 has a very inherently, I would even say, well, using the term Western in a very loose sense, I think Gujian 1, it reminds me more of Marvel than anything else, really. Because in this game, we get the protagonist who actually came with like an inherently built-in huge amount of like destructive power. So he's, I guess, closer to evil at first than he is to good. And that power came within him because of his like sad childhood life story, which I won't kind of talk about too much here, but he kind of carried that power as a curse as we move through the story. And his shifu, so his like mentor who taught him how to fight and everything, helped him kind of contain that destructive power and tried to teach him to be a, well, I guess your typical responsible lad. But because everyone else knew that he carried that power, he was kind of just bullied throughout his life as he was growing up and learning, and he had no friends, and he is just very lost about who he is and what he has to do. So when we come into the game, we see this person kind of just roaming listlessly on the streets and fighting monsters, and you don't really know where he's headed to. You don't really know like what he wants, and it's just very hard to kind of resonate with him at first as a main character, because he seems already like quite powerful, and you know that he like has the ability to do quite powerful things, but he also just doesn't have that because I think the sense of growth, as we've kind of been, I think we've been coming back to this topic, the sense of growth is quite essential to wuxia novels and games. In the games, you actually level up as a character, but in wuxia novels, you often start with the character being like a child, and you see them gradually growing up and learning and getting stronger. But I think for Gujian 1, what really just hit me at first is how different this protagonist is that it seems like he doesn't really need any growth at all. He just is kind of there. And later on, you uncover his life story, and then you see how a lot of his struggle comes from how he thinks that he's a monster for having embodied that evil power. And he has to kind of refrain himself from unleashing that power whenever he's kind of provoked. And he tries to stop himself multiple times from harming his teammates or doing not so great things because of that wicked energy within him. And so, as you mentioned, how, let's say, like in Marvel, the superheroes actually came with more power, and then they realize later on how they need to use power responsibly. that actually parallels what I've been seeing in Gujian 1, and especially kind of regarding the protagonist's unique identity of he is human, but at the same time, other humans see him as a monster, and his own struggles of kind of feeling like he doesn't belong anywhere and having to spend a whole lot of energy on simply suppressing that huge destructive power is a large part of his characterization. So he's definitely not your typical kind of like go-to wuxia hero. And the way that his sense of morality pops up is really throughout this journey. You can kind of see himself gradually acknowledging that, okay, like I know that I will never be someone normal. I know that I can't be your everyday hero, but I'm just going to do whatever I can do, embrace who I am essentially, and go fight my fights. So I think Gujian 1, the whole story carried this very strong sense of tragedy from the very beginning. And I think that has a lot to do with the characterization.
Yeah, that sounds, for a game where the visuals look so kind of simple, sounds like a really deep characterization. I don't think I've got any more questions here, but there was something I was doing a little bit of, well, fevered attempt to read up and get some kind of meaningful thing to say. But when we were doing a little bit of preliminary discussion, I think that the phrase hero's journey popped up. And this was like, I don't know, this immediately triggered some memories in my head, because the first ever academic book I ever or writing of any sort I ever tried to have a go at, I think I must have been about 16, maybe 17. And I got myself a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And I'd been pointed to that by a very literary tome, The Da Vinci Code, which referenced it. So Joseph Campbell, I don't think he's quite as fashionable as he used to do, as he used to be. He's maybe a little bit associated with being, well, maybe number one, being used as a guy who came up with a theory of storytelling, which if you Google him now, or if you Google Hero's Journey now, you get these kind of slightly awful step-by-step guides for how to write a good story or a Hollywood movie. But if you actually read his writing, what he was trying to do was study all the myths of the world, ancient myths, and try and come up, at least in this book, with what he called a monomyth. So one overarching story, which is kind of the story for all of humankind. So kind of an ambitious project. And although it's like, obviously it's kind of a mission that's doomed to fail, because you can't reduce every story to one story, but it's funny in his formula just how many parallels he finds between stories, and how if you look at like the points in the hero's journey that he identified, how strongly some of them jump out in some of the stories that you can read today or see in films or even play in video games. So like when you were describing the character in Gujian 3, who's kind of, he has a duty to his place of birth, the Sky Elk Kingdom. He's got to, it's destiny's calling for him to take up responsibility and look after it, but he's kind of refusing the call. And those are word for word almost two of the key points that Joseph Campbell thought he saw in this monomyth, which are the call to adventure and then the refusal of the call. So the something pulls the hero of the story to action, but at first he says no. And where am I? I'm beginning to fall flat on my face now, because whatever point I was going to make, I've lost. But yeah, I guess if you agree with his assumption that the hero's journey, the monomyth, is universal to what it is to be a human, and that can infuse something into any hero story you read, it would make sense, or it would help explain why wuxia is a genre which, although it's quite specifically Chinese, has had a fair bit of success in like exporting, both in literature and in films. And I think why it's cool to see English subtitles for Gujian, because I know from what I've just said, the third story has this story that really grabs you. You could put it down to like deep archetypal mythic tropes it hits on, or you could put it down to just really good writing, good characterization. But yeah, I have fallen flat on my face now. All I can say is it seems like there's an amazing mythic quality to the games that anyone could enjoy just by virtue of being a human being.
While you mention it, I like how this is kind of becoming like, I guess, more of an open discussion than just answering questions. But yeah, I think it's really interesting that you brought this up, because also, yes, that's Joseph Campbell was actually also one of the first few academic books I've read when I was maybe 16, 17. So I definitely feel you on that. So I think going back to the plot of the games, when you mentioned kind of the call versus refusal of the call, I can see that being executed very well in the storyline, and also in, let's say, if Gujian was written as a novel, that would kind of come out very strongly. But in a game, it's different, because the nature of an RPG game is that your growth is linear. Like, your levels can't just drop. So to some extent, as a hero in the game, you are progressing. You have no choice but to really move forward. Like, there's no way for you to turn back or to actually, quote unquote, refuse the call, because as a player who, to some extent, you are fused with the character, and that's what makes RPG is that you are the character. So no matter what happens on screen as a part of the story, ultimately the player who's in for getting through the game is controlling it. So I think this adds an other interesting bit. It's even kind of like, if you see this as a fiction, it's kind of like metafictional in a way, that it's open to the players. You're there to kind of not really decide really, but you're involved in the world. And because of your involvement, you ultimately know that the character cannot refuse his growth. That, let's say, if a protagonist really just didn't want to be a Sky Elk at all, if this was his story, his world, he could have just been like, oh, okay, whatever, let me just hang out here, and maybe something else would happen. But since he's in a game, he has no choice but to be kind of controlled by the player and to really just move forward, just go. So I think I also got the inspiration of this whole sense of linearity when I was rethinking the plotline of Gujian 1, which I briefly narrated before, but I said that it really resembles a tragedy in general, that Gujian 1 does not feel Chinese at all, actually, the story. I think what I see in Gujian 1 is this, I don't know if I can even put this way, but I'm also not like extremely well read on Greek tragedy, but it definitely felt like a Greek tragedy to me, where the protagonist in the beginning, he kind of knew that because of this destructive power, he would die soon, and that he already knew that he is this monster being, and this is something that he cannot resolve at all. So throughout the whole story, unlike maybe Gujian 2 or 3, where you see the character kind of becoming stronger and leaving and becoming stronger and leaving their home and embarking on new journeys, for Gujian 1, the whole point of the story kind of is, you kind of get the sense in the beginning that you're sending your character to death. That, you know, ultimately he will unleash that power, and ultimately he will die. And you're just kind of there to witness what happens in between, but there's no way for you to really escape that tragedy. And even just the boss setting in Gujian 1 is interesting, because the boss is actually, I know it's like complicated, but the boss of Gujian 1 is actually kind of the, how do you say this? He's like the arch enemy, but also the soulmate of a protagonist.
Like a nemesis?
Yeah, kind of in that way. It's kind of like their souls are literally made out of the same thing. And that's why they're both monsters in our normal people mortal realm. And that's why only they can kind of end each other. And kind of the way to do that, to stop the boss, is for our protagonist to sacrifice himself. So as you kind of gradually gather those information, you know that this tragedy was really like determined to, like the story was determined to be like this even before our actual plotline has begun. And I think approaching our last boss fight, you kind of get a little bit of break in a city before the last city. And I think like, because I've played this game many times, I always like find myself stopping in that city and just kind of pausing there for a very long time and not wanting to move on, because like I know that like once I hit leave city, I know I can't turn back anymore. Like it's just over, done. So to me, Gujian 1 just felt so different of this inner like tragedy, and it's almost like you already know the ending from the beginning, but you still kind of have to get yourself there somehow. And that's a completely different vibe from, let's say, our classic Wuxia or with all the other Gujian games.
Yeah, It reminds me of a few different RPGs I've played where, like, the when the end or the climax is coming, you kind of feel a little calm before the storm and you want to stay in. I can think of quite a few like that. I know the Elder Scrolls game Oblivion I've played. When it gets towards the end, hell literally breaks loose. So, or you get to a final battle and you have to watch Sean Bean die, which, many of us had to endure that many times, and he does it again in Oblivion. Fable has a similar thing. Start like baddies just start popping up everywhere in the final phase of the game. So if you like a fight, it's quite good. But it has not similar, but it has a strong, like, a family drama tragedy. You have to watch your mom get killed after being estranged from her for a long time, and then at the end you have you do have a little bit of maybe some freedom or some moral choices. I was going to mention this, how some RPGs are totally linear. Others offer you some chances to change fate, but just by the limitations of the game, you can't have infinite branching paths like you can in real life, because the disk and your hard drive can't sustain it. Never mind all the work the programmers would have to put in. But yeah, the feeling of not wanting to get to the end because something tragic is going to happen, I guess that's a thing kind of unique to some RPGs, really resonant ones. And what you were saying about this character having a nemesis, like his mirror image that he has to, like, kind of fuse with and, I don't know, die in a way to overcome. I'm sure at the end of Joseph Campbell's description of the hero's journey, he talks about this, that ultimately the hero, if they want to have like a spiritual victory, if they want to reach the real end of their journey and not become corrupt, they have to not just beat their nemesis or their mirror image or their shadow, if you're using the Jungian term, because I'm pretty sure Joseph Campbell was drawing on Jung, and in Jung you don't beat your shadow, your dark self, your shitty side, or the side that you can't reconcile with. You don't beat it in a fight. You don't do self-improvement to overcome it. You have to accept it and let it in. And maybe in a more kind of, if we're being more fatalistic, even a hero has to accept that they're going to die. I'm pretty sure the formulation was a character who, it's kind of a thing that Xianxia breaks, is that if a character refuses their fate, if they refuse the fact they're going to die, they become a villain. So it was funny listening to Deathblade teaching me about how Xianxia works, where characters become effectively immortal and become gods of the universe. And maybe that's why Xianxia is a bit more of a silly genre, because characters don't face tragedy like that main character in Gujian 1, as you were describing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Whoa,
now that you mentioned,
so sad.
yeah, I remember that in the beginning of our episode, you mentioned that, so Xianxia kind of already carries a game-like feeling, in the sense that the essence of Xianxia is upgrading, is that you have to level up, you become stronger, and I know that a lot of the popular Xianxia novels, they even have their own ranking system, or even like a point system, to make this novel as close to a game as possible. And it's very interesting because now that we're talking about Gujian as if it's a story, but there's still the game aspect to it. That when you were talking about how, like, some RPGs give you choices and all of that, I know that one game I played, it's also a Chinese RPG game based on one of Jin Yong's books, but more loosely.
Right.
In that one, you get to choose who you want to marry at the end, but that's it. So,
right.
So that's kind of the self-choice part. But anyways, coming back to Gujian, I think what's, especially for Gujian 1, what kind of made me feel so emotional and just torn is that I see so many layers to this game. I know this might just be me being dramatic, and just having a lot of feelings in general for this game, but in the last part where I have to like control the protagonist and kind of walk him up to like all the way up to the final battle stage and all of that, where I know what's coming, and just, I think during that entire like period, like many things are going on at once. I think as a person, as me, as kind of the game player, I definitely feel just sad, and I know that what's going to happen, and I know like bad things are going to occur at the end, but I have no choice, because if I want to play the game, I have to continue with it. So I can't just kind of build my own world all of a sudden and stop this from happening. So even though I have my quote unquote agency as the real person, as kind of the higher dimension being, it's not like I can do anything else. On the other hand, I can kind of see the dialogue happening. I can see characters talking in the game, and I can see how much our protagonist is struggling, and I'm just kind of like, I feel so bad for you. Like, you've been through so much. Like, I just want you to be happy. Like, I love you. You're like my son. Like, that whole kind of like feeling pops up, and you just really want him to be happy. But you know that even him, from his perspective as a character, he knows that facing this death, this ultimate enemy, is the only choice he has. And then you start kind of, your mind starts wandering off in the more cyberpunk like direction, the science fiction direction, where you're just kind of like, oh, okay, but this world that you're so invested in, this world that kind of contain the life of this character, which you care so much about, is literally just made out of code. It's just kind of like you're programmed to be like this.
Yeah.
And then you start thinking everything about like fate and what does the narrative mean, what does game telling mean, like all of those things. And it's interesting because, can I just like branch off really briefly? But because I got so frustrated with the game after playing it, I got first involved in the whole kind of like fan community, where obviously a lot of fan fiction happened. And in the fan fiction world, the protagonist often did not die.
Of course, yeah.
People just like, I think back then, me and my friends just tried really hard to come up with other solutions to how we could make him not die, and that would also make sense in the context of the story. That was like one large chunk of fan fiction. And I got eventually so mad at the game that I got into like game modification, that I learned coding at like the young age of like 17.
Amazing.
Just to kind of like modify my game and to like make it not be like that. So it's like funny, because when you think about how like the world in the game is ultimately made out of graphics and lines of code, me, by doing that, like, kind of, to me, it feels like the ultimate way of like manipulating fate for the characters that I care a lot about. And that sense of feeling, that sense of control, that sense of, oh, okay, now I'm finally winning over you and struggling away from this tragedy. I think, just to me, doing game mods is definitely a lot more rewarding than writing fan fiction. So that kind of really reshaped my whole relationship with RPG games in general, once I discovered that you can actually like do game mods and really just forcefully inject yourself and change whatever is in that world. So I know this might be carrying myself away from our actual topic, but just wanted to like mention that.
No, I think that all the best podcast discussions do that. They go on tangents, just like all the best school teachers go on tangents. So when you said you were like getting into coding as a means to an end on your strange teenage missions, I can tell you a story where I did something similar, and I think I can bring this back to literature. So I guess I'm 27. I'm not. I think we're roughly of an age. When I started high school, iPods hadn't completely taken over the world of MP3 players, and MP3 players hadn't been replaced by phones. And being a kind of a contrarian kid, well, from when I was a kid, I didn't want to get an iPhone, an iPod. So I had a MP3 player. I became attached to this company called Creative, who made these MP3 players called Creative Zens. And the second Creative Zen I had, it had a very nice interface. The font it used was a nice thin font. But I remember God knows how I fell down this internet wormhole, but I found it was possible to, because you could change the theme, but there were only 6 themes. And I thought, surely there's more spaces in this menu. In theory, you could get more themes. Maybe you can download some from the Zen website. And I think there were none you could download, but people had made their own. So you could get them onto the machine, but you had to mod it. So you had to get very like user unfriendly software. You had to get XML files. You had to reset the firmware, all the stuff I'd never done before. But I taught it. And I got to do out of that was add some themes, change like the booting screen, the little animation that plays when you turn it on, and change the fonts. So some of the changes I made were kind of tasteful, but one totally not tasteful thing I did was I replaced that nice thin sans serif font with a font called Bleeding Cowboys, which was like a completely ornamental, like emo, heavy metal sort of font. And this is where I'm going to try and link it back to fan fiction, because it's like changing it to this crazy font is an idea that's like cool in theory and at a superficial level, but at some deeper level, it kind of goes against the harmony of the structure of the whole thing. It's better to have a minimalist font than this flashy one. And I feel like when I've been tempted to write fan fiction, or when I've looked at fan fiction that I guess usually kids have written, they're trying to do things with the story that at first impulse you'd really want to do, but the writer hasn't done because they don't work. And I feel like that's probably why a lot of, okay, here's an example. The BBC show Sherlock, where they were...
Oh my God. I was so into that fandom when I was like a teacher. Yeah.
Right. And I think it had such like a fan fiction fandom thing because they were constantly teasing some kind of a relationship between Holmes and Watson. But of course, the whole point is that it's all teasing. And if they actualized it, the whole thing's ruined. But that's where kind of fan fiction comes in. You can, because it's like a lesser, sillier form, it's fine to break the rules and eat the whole box of chocolates, if you know what I mean.
Right. No, I completely feel you because I know that Gujian in China, all 3 games have like a very strong fan fiction community. And I think it's exactly because these games have such well-built worlds and have left enough kind of empty spaces in between for people to be like, let me follow my favorite character and write a story for them. And I think this, the structure of these games give you just the right amount of freedom to, while kind of being in a general structure and having the safety of having like a very established world for you to explore. On the other hand, it doesn't kind of quote unquote like kill the story. Like the story isn't set in stone. There's a lot of spaces left for people to just fill in whatever they want to fill in. And I think even just the minor characters have a lot of potential to be explored. So I think Gujian really does storytelling like extremely well. And I think people are just very emotional in general regarding the characters in the games of all 3 games in the series. So even though they're very different in graphics, very different in setting, the main plot is different, the one thing that doesn't change is that it does amazing world building and also amazing just character building that I think people just prize those characters as characters who actually are complex and have their own goals and ambitions, and it's very easy to like love a character in the Gujian games compared to like, let's say, another game where it's mostly just about fighting, it's about advancing and not so much about anything else. Because speaking of storytelling, can I just actually go back a little bit to a point that we were trying to make, but I remember that I didn't actually finish it.
I do that all the time, and usually I just let it go and regret it weeks later. So yeah, you'd better go for it.
Yeah, because we're talking about I know the word Xianxia popped up like a lot during the conversation, and we mentioned maybe like 3 times already that Xianxia gives off a like game vibe inherently. It's interesting because what Gujian is doing here is that I see it doing a more traditional sense of storytelling where they focus tremendously on the world, the characters, the plot line, and sometimes, like Wuxian 1, not so much on gaming itself even. But on the other hand, for a lot of Xianxia stories that are just super long and are like always going and going, that's kind of the reverse of what I'm seeing in Gujian, is that it's a story and it's not a game. But the feeling you get in those stories is very similar to the feeling you get in a game where all you do is upgrade. And I know that people, like a lot of people read Xianxia definitely not for the character or the plot, but simply for the feeling of, oh, okay, like I'm following this person, I'm seeing how this person is advancing, is upgrading, is leveling up, and eventually this person becomes like super powerful, and that's the end. So I wonder if kind of cognitively, psychologically, the enjoyment you get from reading that kind of Xianxia is on par to playing a game where leveling up and killing monsters and gathering treasure is the priority, versus Gujian, where I think the reason there's so much fan fiction surrounding it and the reason that people just care so much about like things other than gameplay, such as graphics, such as world building, and the reason why like even at our 10th anniversary that happened just now, like so many fans from before, they like still come to celebrate, they still are like drawing pictures and writing fiction to kind of celebrate that, celebrate this world. Is it because what Gujian is doing, its priority is actually close to what we see in a good pop novel? So I'm just like had that quick thought about like I guess, the different cognitive effects of game playing versus storytelling, and storytelling games, obviously.
Yeah, well, once I've raised enough money through this podcast Patreon, I'll set up like a neurology lab, and we can strap up, with little brain signal readers, one person, or maybe one control group reading Xianxia novels, and then another control group playing various RPGs, and then we can see if the brains light up in the same places, and then we can confirm or deny that theory.
Oh God, please do it. I'd be so excited.
Yeah, it would get headlines anyway. So we've talked quite a lot about heroes and heroic journeys. You have mentioned boss fights a few times, which is cool because it's probably not going to be quite so deep. We'll see. But I'd like to ask you a wee bit about the monsters and the villains of the Gujian games, the Gujian world. Because at least when I was playing Gujian 3, I've fought 3 bosses myself and saw some others on videos on YouTube. It felt like they were quite modern. Like they felt like they were from a more kind of international, not homogenized is a negative word, but they felt like they could have come from like gothic horror, gaming, pop culture, and that kind of like that milieu, however you say that French word I just described, has a lot of influence from Lovecraftian stuff. Like, I don't know, Lovecraftian monsters in games and movies are probably they're pretty much a separate thing from actual horrors in Lovecraft stories. I feel like they've kind of split off like a cell and evolved in their own direction. Like, to give you an idea what I'm talking about, there's, when you start off Gujian 3, you're playing as the main character's brother. So it's an interesting, it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm sure I played other games that do this. I can't think of any, but you start off as
Assassin's Creed, I think. One of the Assassin's Creed games.
Oh, yes. I've never played that, but I watched my sibling play it. But yeah, you start off with all the powers and fully leveled up. So you get a glimpse of what you can be, essentially. So it throws you into the fantasy world. You are incredibly strong, which is great because you're easily beat the monsters the game throws at you. But then I got kind of like really freaked out because it throws you up against a massive, like a city-sized demon.
I was gonna refer to that. Oh my God. Like,
yeah, it's hard
that
not
was
to.
very Lovecraft. Like the one with like a lot of I think a lot of like tornado like tentacles coming out. That one.
Tentacles, eyes. He's like he's half boulder, half turtle. He's like really dark purple color. He's coming through a portal to destroy the whole dimension. So like, I don't know, that feels to me like pop culture Lovecraft rather than weird fiction eerie Lovecraft. But like, I guess the point I'm trying to make is it felt like it was coming from, you could call it Western culture. I think it'd be more sensible to say like just like world pop culture, modern stuff basically. So since you know more about the games, I'm wondering, is that what all the monsters and villains are like, or are any of them a little bit more like quote unquote traditional and Chinese?
I think this one, very good point, because I also feel like this happens specifically in Gujian 3. And I think part of the reason is that the game makers are prepared to put Gujian 3 out into the world. And that's obviously why they only had that one translated, and it's on Steam. So I think while they made the game, the ambition was to make this quote unquote more international than before. So I don't know exactly if this is behind the motivation of, let's say, making Skyelk City the way it is, or incorporating more kind of classical Western RPG game monsters. But I can definitely see that being a source of inspiration, because this doesn't happen in the first 2 games. Like we mentioned just now, the monster in the beginning of Gujian 3 really just screams like Western RPG at me when I saw it, and I'm just like, wow, what am I even playing? Like, I don't know where I am.
Right.
For Gujian 1, at least, which I think is the one that they tried hardest to get close to Chinese culture, almost all the monsters are based on some kind of creature from mythology, that they're properly named, they have like references, and there's like backstories, and also because in all the Gujian games you have like a monster glossary as well, that whoever like fight, you can collect their like glossary item and you kind of know what they are. And I remember pretty clearly that in Gujian 1 the monsters are all like very mythological, and also like some historical, and some are just like people to me, that also was a very strong like element of their overall let's do traditional culture sense. Versus Gujian 3, I think the monsters got more sloppy, that it's more kind of like creative all over the place, and also especially put under the setting that the Skylock people are guarding the kind of the portal to the demon realm. So their job is to fight demons like all the time. And once you like see what the demons are, you realize that the demons who are kind of like climbing out of that portal, like the one we mentioned just now, the big eye, purple, black thing, like it's obviously no longer kind of a part of mythology. Even though like I personally think it could still be, but that's kind of the game maker's decision. Maybe they just wanted to try a different kind of aesthetic. So that's kind of what I've been seeing. But I think as you approach the latter bits of Gujian 3, you see that the monsters they're fighting are no longer monsters, but more or less like actual people, like other characters involved in the storyline.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it gets more interesting, because I think approaching the latter bits of Gujian 3, that's where the whole team eventually kind of gets in touch with super like ancient mythological history. Like, so for example, one person joins their group and you later on realize that this person is a reincarnation of like basically the father of all men in Chinese mythology, who like actually exists. And so as he joins the main story plot, the story kind of takes a turn and begins to be more about kind of like history and even just like tracing like all the way tracing up to like where your ancestors were. It kind of became all about that instead of the Skylock people. So I think Gujian 3 really kind of comes in different segments, and the vibe is different with every like city you get to and with every person who like comes to join you. So I think that the whole sense of like, is this Lovecraft, is this like more Western, gets diluted a lot when you approach kind of the ending bits of the story.
Right. You mentioned cities, and that's reminding me. So earlier you talked about how Gujian 2 was a really they had a really interesting representation and use of Chang'an. Do any of the Gujian games use any other historical Chinese cities as settings, like specifically, or is that the only one that they've really tried to bring into the game?
Well, actually, all the cities in Gujian are based in on cities in reality. So they actually don't have fictional cities at all, except for like obviously like Skyelk, which is kind of not a part of the mortal world. But every city that's in the mortal world is based on a real place, and they try to kind of like make it as close to history as possible. So I think what's interesting is that they would get into these ridiculously neat details that they drew from history and ancient books, and you're just kind of like, wow, like they really didn't have to do that to make the game work, but they did. So I think, for example, in Gujian 3, you would enter this like huge city, forgot the name, but I think it's the first kind of like major, like large mortal city after you finish all of the Skyelk drama in the beginning. And in that city, it's called the City of Flowers, and everyone kind of makes like dye paint based on the flowers that grow around the city. And you actually can like just walk around and visit all those like places with like huge like buckets of paint just resting there, or just people drying out the newly dyed clothing. And this like adds nothing to the game, but it's just like pretty. And you can like talk to like people who are working in the factories and get to know a lot about how the city is like historically and how it gained its name and why paint is important and different kinds of flowers and herbs that are put into paint. You just get a lot of like, I guess, useless knowledge, but it's cool anyways. And the other thing that they do is that I think now I'm getting more into the cultural aspect, but I know that I mentioned this many times that Gujian is like very big on getting the cultural and historical details right, that it kind of sees educating game players and not like, I wouldn't say promoting Chinese culture, but kind of like incorporating Chinese culture as one of its game making missions. And they do it more so than all of the other games I've seen that obviously focus more on just the game playing or kind of the story itself, but Gujian really cares a lot about that. And I think another branch I want to go off into is the voiceover. I think you might have realized that while you're playing, the characters actually like speak and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
So Gujian pays a lot of attention to voice actors, and the really interesting part is that in different cities, and that are because the cities are historically based on cities in different places of China, and they have dialects. So sometimes they would get like voice actors to even do voiceovers for major NPCs of every city, and they would purposely get people from those regions of China to do the voiceover in their local dialect to make it even more realistic.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
The city with all the paint, which
Mm-hmm.
historical city is that based on? Do you know?
Right now, I don't remember. It's just
Right.
kind of like something, this example just came to my mind.
Okay.
Definitely look it up later, but because Gujian 3 is set in like a time period that's, I think it's supposed to be like earlier, just like quite early in general. So it's not like a city that we would be kind of casually just familiar with.
Right.
And I think they mostly took inspiration from like the older history texts.
Okay, I got you.
So
Yeah.
because the story plot towards the end is all about like super like ancient mythological people, and it's no longer like Gujian 2, let's say, which is more about like, oh, Tang Dynasty, the emperor. So I think to get that vibe, they really kind of dug into not just history, but mythology and just a lot of like, oh, like human origin stories of China kind of things to get the vibe right.
Right. Yeah, this was something, something that interested me when I did my first little bit of learning about Chinese history is the different eras. Of course, like anytime something is happening in history in one part of the world, other things are happening in other parts of the world. So when I was watching Legend of the Demon Cat, was it Yao Mao?
Yeah.
Forgot the Chinese name.
Yao Mao Zhuan.
Yao Mao Zhuan. Yes, Yao Mao Zhuan. That's set, like we were saying, in the Tang Dynasty, and I was watching it with my girlfriend who's just finished her own PhD in Anglo-Saxon and Norse literature. So she knows a fair bit about that period of history mostly in England and a little bit like in Denmark and whatnot. But she asked me like, wait, when is this? Because I told her a little bit about the Tang Dynasty, like why. I was like, here's why they're trying to make it visually look so nice, and because the Tang Dynasty and Chang'an were so important, blah 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 blah. And she said, when was that? And I told her like something like the 700 AD or thereabouts. And she said, oh wait a minute, what? This was happening at the same time that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were in England. And I was like, yes, but yeah, it's not like she wouldn't have realized that, or it's not like she would have thought that would be impossible. But it's just. It was a little bit like when I was learning about, I don't know, when I learned how massively important Chang'an was, I'd never put it against like parallel historical contexts. I had a similar experience. My last year of high school, we did a school exchange to Japan, and we went to one of the places we went was Nara. We saw the giant Buddha there, and I guess they dated what year that it was built. It was something like 1000 AD. But it was just light years ahead of anything that would have been happening in Scotland, my own country at that time. And it's just a bit of a mind blower. It was a mind blower for me anyway. So yeah, the point I'm getting to here is that if I was playing these games, I wouldn't necessarily be able to place what time a setting was drawing on based on like the characters' costumes or the architecture. Even with the knowledge of China I have now, I wouldn't really be able to tell the different ones apart as I would be able to, like if it was set in the British Isles or even medieval Europe or the Mediterranean, I could probably place it reasonably well based on the costumes and the settings. So would Chinese gamers, interesting phrase, would Chinese gamers, if they saw the settings in Gujian 3, would they know it was like early China? Like when you're saying the founding of China or the early China, would that be like the Zhou dynasty around then, or even earlier than that?
I think probably even earlier than that. So more like the mythological ages where kind of like human activity first started. But our story is not necessarily kind of dated all the way like that back, but you can certainly tell that it's based more or less in a just earlier time period in general.
Right. And what are the like visual cues that would help you pick up on that?
I think one important thing is that in a lot of the cities, the houses are less like fancy.
Mm.
That I think they're just very earthly. I think you can see more, let's say, clay pots lying everywhere. You can see kind of like totems and things that cue at how the setting is more or less kind of all the way back in the mythological ages. And also I cheated and looked up the city name. It's called Yanling, the city of like flower and pain.
Cool. I'll try and put that in the show notes for listeners as well. How would I spell that in Pinyin? Is it Yanling? Yanling?
Exactly, you got it.
Okay,
so
cool.
I think continuing what we said before, I think another important thing for at least the Chinese gamers is the name of the cities, because I guess like names of a lot of Chinese cities don't change that much over time. So Yanling as a city still exists nowadays.
Right. In Hunan?
And so when you see that city, it's in Henan.
Henan,
So,
right.
And I guess for someone who's familiar with Chinese mythology and culture, when you see that this place is in Henan, you're just kind of like, oh, I see what you're doing, because I guess the common knowledge is that Henan is the place where I guess the first, like, the mythologies happened, and people say that kind of the ancestors, like the, like, I think some translations call it the quote unquote, the Yellow Emperor. So he's from Henan. So that's where his tomb was found and all of that. So Henan has always been prided as kind of the origin, the place where the tombs were, the ancestors were. So once we see that, oh, like these cities are obviously in Henan or around that location, we know what's kind of going on. We know that like we know that the story is going to be somewhat about that age of mythology compared to anything else. So definitely I think geography and location and names as labels is kind of one direction pointing thing that helps at least the Chinese gamers identify the historical period and kind of like synthesizing what they see visually with what they know about history. And it's interesting because I think drawing the conversation a little bit back to Chang'an, not just me, but actually one of my friends, and she has this like little brother who's growing up and just learning history, and he like wasn't really interested, but she like pulled up the game and kind of like sat him next to the game and showed him that like, oh look, this is Chang'an. And because the city in Gujian is actually vaguely, well, pretty accurately based on like a Chang'an map, which is very square. You have all the major streets, the markets are in the right places. So she kind of just gave him a tour of the city in the game, and he's like, oh, okay, now I can conceptualize, like now I know what this is all about, which is cool. So the point I was going to make was that, right, like because you mentioned the realization of like, oh wow, like this happened this year, but it's so hard to connect what's happening in, let's say, country A with what's happening in country B, especially if you're less familiar with the history and culture of one of the countries. And I think the one major thing that Gujian does, which is also, I guess, like a main theme that I keep on coming back to, is how much Gujian, and not just Gujian, but games in general, just visual world buildings in games, in movies, how much that helps us see and imagine things that previously would have seemed strange or unfamiliar.
Yeah. I know I keep going back to that game Fable, but it does also, so many times we've been talking about Gujian, and there's something similar that Fable does. So one of the things, names, like I said earlier, it has the name Albion, that's an old pre-Roman name for the British Isles. So it's clearly cluing you in where you're in a fantasy version of. Another thing that makes it similar to Gujian is that a lot of the monsters, in fact, I think all the monsters are some kind of a version of a creature from either British but more generally European mythology. And one of them are hobs, who are these little gnome-like horrible little monsters that, although they're quite small, they cause you all sorts of trouble. And that's how I learned about hobs. I didn't know, if someone had asked me prior to that, what's a hob, I would have said, oh, it's a thing that you cook food on. And then they would say, no, what is the hob for mythology? And I would have said, what on earth are you talking about? But because I played this game when I was about 13, I have an idea. So yeah, it's cool that your friends, did you say it was your friend's younger brother? Yeah, it's cool that he got to enjoy that. And it's great that video games looks sufficiently immersive now that he could get, like, it can serve as well as just an adventure game, like you were saying, like a virtual tour of Chang'an. That's really
Right.
cool. It's something I wouldn't
Like
have
kind of,
got at his age on my Game Boy, if you know what I mean.
I know. It's like you kind of get the, I guess the juice of being able to like kind of explore and talk to people and discover things on your own in this game.
Mm.
Like if you kind of cut out the actual plot line and you just kind of place people in the city and have them walk around, it's already like pretty like purely educational on its own, from just having the privilege of interacting, of having that kind of like feeling of you yourself is controlling like the mouse or whatever, than to just sit in a classroom setting or even just look at a documentary. Like it's a completely different way of learning and
Mm.
engaging your brain and body. So I think this really brings a lot of potential to game as a kind of media for not just telling stories, but also transmitting culture and providing educational value.
Yeah. The next set of questions I've got are all kind of technical ones. I think I might jump ahead to one based on what you just said about
Yeah.
cultural exchange. So, a big reason why I do the podcast is because of cultural exchange. Like, the kind of very crass way of looking at it I have is we're living in a time where there is a lot of tension, maybe not between ordinary people, but between the people in charge of China and the people, unfortunately, a lot of the people in charge of the Western world are not acting with great intentions. Some of them are, but we're living in rather fraught times. So I like to think cultural exchange is one thing that should help us not blow each other up. And I guess I really had that thought when I was listening to a BBC radio show about the kind of cooling of tensions at the end of the Cold War, and there was some kind of TV show where they had brought, is such a stupid simple thing, but they had brought together some ordinary people from Soviet Russia and from like England or something, and they're like, oh yeah, these people do similar stuff to me, they have similar concerns. And it seems so silly in some ways, but in other ways you're like, yeah, well, if they're, although in theory we could easily reach out into other cultures and enjoy them, our default mode is just to go to the things that consumerism feeds us, or to go to what we're most familiar with. So yeah, that's, I think, a really cool thing about the fact that literature can be translated. You can read, me, an English speaker, or someone, maybe a better example is like my friends who like to read books but have no connection with, country A, B, or C, be it China or some other country. They can go and read a book that's popular in that country if it's translated into English. So like literature as a cultural vector it's great. I think it's fantastic. Video games, though, another maybe sad thing about the age we live in is less people read, more people enjoy more immediate media, let's say, media that throws you in with maybe less effort sounds too judgmental, but it's much easier to get thrown into a movie or a video game than it is a book. A book, you need a little bit of focus, a little bit of peace and quiet. A game, you don't. So like I have a 13-year-old sister, and it's very easy to get her on her phone. It's easy to get her to read fan fiction based on TV shows that she watches online on Wattpad. It's almost impossible to get her to read a book. So yeah, do you think, here's the question after minutes of preambling about high and mighty ideas about world peace. Do you think there's a lot of as yet untapped potential in bringing games like Gujian into English? Because I guess it's another, maybe a not so great thing about translation is it can be unidirectional, or the flow, it's a little bit like a trade imbalance in a way. Stuff flows out of English into other languages and other cultures at a much greater level than stuff flows into English. So like, as an English speaker, it's very easy to be in a bubble. I'm sure there are lots of games made in the English speaking world that you can play in China, not so much in the other direction, with the exception of maybe mobile apps, which I'm sure lots of mobile apps made in China aren't trying to sell people on, Chinese culture. I've got one that is called Animal Restaurant, which is, have you heard of that one?
No.
I'll have to talk about that later. It's a fantastic game, and it's available in Chinese, well, simplified and traditional Chinese, English, and then some like Southeast Asian languages as well. I think a lot of people who play it are from like Vietnam and stuff. But yeah, the question, sorry, I keep getting distracted. Do you think games like Gujian could blow up or find an audience in the English-speaking world? And if it does, do you think it would be people in the Chinese diaspora, or do you think it could really go like international with people who have no connection with China? Because I guess Wuxia, to some extent in cinema, is a little bit of a success story. Wuxia literature, maybe not yet, but with the translation of Condor Heroes, maybe. But what about Gujian?
So I think I also have a lot that I want to say regarding this topic. Because I think, first of all, yay to games saving the world, bringing world peace. I'm like totally for that.
Of course.
And especially at a time like now, like we all know that the world is becoming more and more, unfortunately, sad
and angry.
People
it's
hate
becoming more angry.
And like I think as someone who has spent a lot of time in America and China, like the current situation is horrible, so I won't go into that. It just will get sadder from here, so I'll stop myself before I get carried away. But the main point here is that in a lot of my previous talks about translation, I keep on mentioning one thing, is that a lot of translators like myself who do Chinese to English translations are very hesitant upon taking up projects that address Chinese mythology or kind of classical / ancient elements, because the sheer difficulty is that when you try to illustrate a myth from Chinese into English, you do realize that there is no such equivalence. There's no base for you to draw inspiration from. So it's kind of like you have to recreate all of that from scratch in your translation. And in literature, that often becomes very hard work, because let's say if you have a short story and this person bases the story on some kind of mythology, then does that mean the translator has to take pages and lots of footnotes to explain the mythology itself before the story can even begin? Like, it just becomes very hard. And I think, to be frank here, is that like you said just now, people in China now, we grew up reading like Greek myth or Christian myth, or just things that people in the Western world also know. But it's definitely not the same the other way around. That if you mention, even just now talking in this podcast, like when I say, let's say, Yellow Emperor, or if I address like the kind of monster, the guardian monster that the Sky Elves are based on, I still have to go through a lot of effort trying to explain myself and find the right vocabulary, because there really is no such glossary present in English for me to really just draw upon immediately and be like, oh, like let's say if I say Zeus, we'll all know that Zeus is Zeus. But when I say Sky Elk or Yellow Emperor, even though it's very common in Chinese culture, there is no such equivalence. It's not even just on the linguistic level, but it's really just like cognitively that concept doesn't exist. And to people who, I guess, like even like a lot of my, let's say my American friends, sorry for picking on them, but like you said, they do live in some kind of like an English bubble where
the bubble within the bubble.
Right. It's kind of like works of translation just does not exist on their bookshelves. Like, they do not feel the need to read beyond English or even read beyond America, really. So in this context, especially being aware of this context as a translator who's working, like, I mean, I think I'm in this more or less unique position where I work both ways, that translating from English into Chinese is definitely a lot easier than translating from Chinese into English, because for the former, I can just translate things as it is. I don't necessarily have to add in a ton of footnotes to explain the story. I can address like myth and god names and references, and I know that my target audience in China will be okay with it, because that's what we all grew up reading as children. That it's already been so ingrained into our everyday culture and our vocabulary. But once you switch it around, it's not even just about making the stories and the characters and the myth available linguistically, but to really just capture people's interest, and not to make them feel like, oh wow, I open up this story and immediately on the first page it's about a myth I have no idea about and I don't want to care about it, so let me just throw it away. So I know it sounds really cruel, but I think that's what we're facing right now, especially in the pop culture world, is that the general average, I guess, like English reader in a bubble, they're very used to kind of being in a self-sufficient cultural sphere where mostly they're reading stuff that's written in English. And to even get them to start caring about a peripheral culture, language, or voice like Chinese, let's say, especially pop culture, is already kind of hard to begin with.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of capture the balance of not butchering your culture and the author's intent and mythologies into kind of shortened, chopped up versions of blatant Orientalism to capture the eye. You have to balance that versus not making things look extremely unfamiliar and boring and academic to turn people away. Mm-hmm. So it's always been a struggle for translators to capture that balance, especially regarding stories that draw upon Chinese mythology and culture, like classical culture. But I know that was a lot of talk, but bring this back, that was talking about translating literature. But to me, I think in a more positive sense, I think games can actually achieve that a lot more easily. I know even though there are not enough games that Chinese people have made that has been translated into English, and I know Gujian 3 has just kind of come out still quite recently, and it's kind of like a baby step. But I do see like a bigger potential for culture exchange coming from the realm of games, because for games, you actually overcome this sense of like, oh, what if this long passage of description turns people away? That the myth, the culture, it's already embedded in the visuals, that even someone who have no idea of what Chang'an City is like culturally, they can still play the game and be like, oh, okay, this is just this one big main city I'm exploring. And whatever I see in this game will be my first encounter with what Chang'an means symbolically. So the inherent kind of like visual aspect, you don't really have to like interact with words that much, is already kind of a great advantage for games to being accepted by people who don't necessarily know the culture. So I think that really compensates for the one like big source of headache for translators upon translating literature, is the lines and lines of descriptions and whether that would kind of capture people's attention. But in games, you can kind of just like not really give a shit and put things down, and it's more the visuals and the interactions that would keep people hooked, and the translator of the game doesn't have to work on that anymore. So it's actually, I think, to some extent easier, I would say, that if I imagine myself translating Gujian, I'd be a lot more relieved. I could just kind of like directly translate the terms, the glossaries, into more kind of accurate, more just academic dictionary-like ways, and like Wikipedia pages, and slap them into the glossary slot, because that's obviously where you go to read about the cultural references, and not having to worry so much about keeping the balance between, oh, how can I portray this? How can I approach this? How can I explain this myth while kind of preserving its essence and also not making it seem too boring? So that doesn't exist anymore. Like, I hope I made sense just now.
That makes a lot of sense. As you were talking, I was thinking about when I, being in China myself, dealing with the language that I speak, English, and the language environment I was in, Chinese. So I was a foreign teacher, basically, and especially in my first year, I was there to teach English to kids who were learning it for the first time. And the like absolute teaching language for dummies lesson I was taught when I did my TEFL courses preparation, the teacher said, okay, I'm going to teach you a concept. The concept is called realia. You should always try to use realia in your classes. And all that meant was, if you want to teach a word, bring in like an object, bring in the actual object. So like the fastest way to teach kids what the word for apple is in English is to bring an apple, show them an apple, point at it and say apple, right. Just visualize it. So yeah, what you're saying about how if you want someone who's never heard of Chang'an to get a grasp of Chang'an, we could talk about it on a podcast for hours, but that's not, it's going to be slower and not as effective as throwing them into, you know, a visual of Chang'an. Picture says 1,000 words, or a real 3D thing says even more than a picture, I suppose you could say. So that's the thing about being a teacher. The thing about being just a foreigner who spoke a different language living there. So one of the more amusing things about like the Laowai life, being a foreigner in China, was that unless you were hanging out with some real idiots who had no interest in learning anything about the country they come to live in, some new words would enter your vocabulary, and they would mostly be loan words. So to think of a few, like, well, Lawai is one, the word for foreigner. Shufu maybe,
Right.
i.e. if you were interacting with the janitors in the school you worked at. And there's lots and lots more, obviously. But the fun thing was, like, English, one good thing about English, one open thing about English is that it takes in lots of words from other languages. It's quite flexible in that way. And a thing I was thinking about as a language learner, or someone trying to deal with, maybe not like a cultural learner, trying to get my head around Chinese things and concepts, was how few words from Chinese culture exist as loan words in English. Like, off the top of my head, there's feng shui, and then names of various martial arts, although those mostly exist in English as I think Cantonese rather than Mandarin, that most of the Chinese nation speaks. I remember being drawn back to this thought when I was reading Ken Liu's translation of Waste Tide by Chen Qiufan, which I covered on the show with Stanley Chen as a guest. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, gosh, Ken's gone out of his way here to use lots of loan words from lots of regional languages. So in Waste Tide, there are Mandarin words alongside the English. But there are also Cantonese words. There's one or two Japanese words. And I felt like maybe he was making an effort to set the Mandarin pinyin words alongside those other regional words. And I know that I think it was either himself or Chen Qiufan had talked about new words from Mandarin entering English in their pinyin spellings, like Shanzhai, which seems a little bit optimistic. Shanzhai, you can read articles about what that word means, and if you're in the know, you know what it means. But if that word is going to end up in English, it's still on the way, probably like a lot of other words from Mandarin. It made me, when I think about that, I think about Japanese and just how successfully so many Japanese words exist in English. In fact, like, there are words I've seen translators use Japanese words to explain Chinese concepts, because one that really surprised me living in China was I saw these little, the little miniature trees that as a Westerner I would call bonsai, I would call it. And I was with a Chinese person, and I said, "Oh, look, it's a bonsai tree. It's a Japanese thing." And my Chinese friend was like, "What? That is Chinese tradition." I'm sorry, but I don't remember the Chinese word. It's still, I learned it for a while, but bonsai is still what that word means in my head. So yeah, I guess if there's a question there, it's, do you think there's hope for a future where more Chinese loan words exist in English? Or do you think there's a long way to go before it can be as successful as Japanese in that regard?
I think that's a really good point in general. The example I was going to give was the word senpai in Japanese, because even just in my college, which is like American college, people are already addressing each other as like senpai or like kohai. And when that word comes out, like, no one seems to feel like it's a problem at all. That it kind of like captures the feeling of someone who's in your same institution and yet is a few years older than you. So it kind of has that siblinghood feeling to it. And yet you can't, like, it's different from actually calling someone sister. So definitely I think the word senpai, alongside with all of its cognitive references of how this kind of specific, I guess, like, school culture in Japan that it's pointing to, is mapped onto this word senpai. And this word in turn gets into English vocab, and the concept behind it enters the whole kind of like general English speaker cognition as well. So it's just interesting generally to think about how words enter different languages, not as merely like linguistic constructions, but how they actually come with underlying cognitive packages of information. I think as of now, as a translator, I know that there's still like a very long way to go before Chinese pinyin can enter English, which is inherently a very flexible language that can kind of adopt a lot of different sorts of influences. But I do hope to see that kind of happen in the future. And I think one of the great jobs that translators, and I think especially shout out to Ken here, what he's doing in not just his translations, but his original writing is that he keeps on pushing the boundaries of what it means to use language, what it means to use English. And I definitely see him doing this kind of throughout his just career in general, really. Sometimes he would just use pinyin directly, like we see in Wastetide, and explaining the concept that comes with that pinyin while he's translating. So to kind of establish that in the context of the story to make it work. On the other hand, I think these kind of how, I guess, foreign languages can come into your main language and modify it. This doesn't just happen on the word level, but also on, let's say, idioms and metaphors. And if we want to talk bigger, also large chunks of narratives and mythologies. These all can happen. And I think one thing that Ken also does is that when he's writing and when he's translating, sometimes he would just preserve the original Chinese, like we say 成语. So it's kind of like established phrase of wording that points to a certain meaning. And often they come in shapes of metaphors. So for example, I remember clearly that in Ken's book, The Grace of Kings, there's one description describing how one character is willing to basically be loyal and protect his friend. And the way he described was that the protagonist said to his friend that, oh, okay, like I'm willing to stick knives in between my ribs to protect you. And that's actually a direct translation of a very common Chinese metaphor. The Chinese is 两肋插刀, which means what I said just now, to stick knives in between the ribs for your friends. And that's like an established phrase to describe loyalty. And even though this metaphor isn't common in English, I think once he's portrayed it under his given narrative context, it suddenly makes a lot of sense. And you're just kind of like, oh, wow, like this metaphor looks and feels so different in English, but it's still working. And I can imagine if someone is interested in kind of looking at the details of his language and picking up these linguistic creations, they would definitely find inspiration in the way that how translations can expand our existing, not just glossary, but also our existing repertoire for metaphors and for figurative language. And I think if we even just open up this idea to going back to Gujian again, I guess my hope here is that through having more and more games like this that incorporate history and cultural mythology, enter the general world or enter the English-speaking world, which is now we all know it's kind of at the center of the cultural scene of our entire globe. By having this there, perhaps someone who has no idea what Chinese culture / mythology is like, through playing this game, in the end, they may still not have read anything about China, but they've learned much about this from the game, that they know that, well, okay, like I know nothing about who, let's say, the Yellow Emperor is or where Yanling is at. But after the game, I know that Yanling is a place that does a lot of tie-dye, and the Yellow Emperor is a dude that has all these backstories and who I've played in the game, which is kind of already an enough starter for the certain person to catch a glimpse of what a culture different from their own can be like. And eventually, if this happens frequent enough, and if people are, I guess, like trying hard enough to make it happen, I think we can dream of the day where different mythologies from different cultures can really all come to melt together through this kind of game as an especially flexible type of media for having first of all visuals, but also the interactive factor.
Totally, yeah. It occurred to me when you mentioned Grace of Kings, there was something we'd kind of talked about in the run-up, which still hasn't come up, and that's a term that Ken Leo coined to describe his series of fantasy novels, kind of inspired by Chinese history and culture and so on. The term is silkpunk, so
Right.
kind of like a spin on steampunk. But you had used it to describe, I think, Gujian too. So
Right.
that's really interesting, because that's taking a term that, as far as I'm aware, was coined after that game came out, but can be applied to it in a way that makes sense. So describe something that existed before it. So I found a really good definition that Ken gave of silkpunk but stupidly, I don't have it in front of me. Do you think you could succinctly describe what that term means, and then relate it to tell us how it relates to Gujian 2?
I think if you take the term apart, you look at the silk and the punk. So if we look at how silk punk comes into the family of like steampunk and cyberpunk, you can see that the silk is kind of like, it refers to the aesthetic that stories or visuals or games that I think can be classified into the silk punk genre are generally things, creations that embodies the essential kind of East Asian aesthetic that can be kind of, I guess, essentialized with the word silk. Material-wise, there's like silk, bamboo, etc., and how often these stories and worlds are based on a lot of like East Asian mythology and culture. So that's the silk part. And the punk part is more interesting because I think it essentially describes a feeling, a vibe to rebel against what these elements used to be regarded as, and to give them a new meaning and to use them for your own means. So I think that's a very vague way of trying to put silk and punk together. But if I was to use one sentence to describe what it is, I think silk punk means to essentially attribute new meanings to these East Asian aesthetic elements and history and culture.
Right. And was it Gujian 2 you said that had some kind of silk punk elements?
So I think to refer to that, it's actually more on the superficial aesthetic side.
Right.
But I think a large part of Ken's story is how silk punk is tied together with like engineering and like essentially like science fiction, right? Because a lot about science fiction is how the science and the tech are created. And the cool thing about Ken's novels and his world building is that he talks a lot about how these seemingly kind of like, I guess like, how do I put this? Is that he combines, let's say, bamboos and silk of these materials that do not necessarily serve the function of, let's say, generating like large spaceships, or like aircraft, sorry, not spaceships, that's like too modern, of generating aircrafts. You would not think of those things as materials that could create aircrafts, but in Ken's books, he actually describes in detail how you can basically like make very complex engineering and produce very kind of like conceptually just modern and science fiction-y machines with these seemingly unrelated materials. And that's a huge part of his silk punk aesthetic, is to be able to accomplish that kind of thing. And actually, like, because of the inherent connection between silk punk as a genre with like science fiction in general, out of Gujian 1, 2, and 3, I know I'm talking about this because I'm like obviously a science fiction fan, but Gujian 2 actually stands out a lot as I see it as inherently a science fiction story, despite it being completely set in a kind of fantastical Tang Dynasty China setting. And the story, without spoiling it too much, is essentially about a person who tried to produce like a real life robot replica of himself using the kind of bamboo and silk and materials we've talked about that's only available that's available to people in like Tang Dynasty China, the seemingly kind of primitive materials that you would never think of could be like a part of an actual functional robot. And that's the essence of the entire story. And that's where kind of the story plot develops. So if you kind of take apart the descriptions, you take apart the world setting, the story in essence is about like artificial intelligence, it's about engineering, it's about people kind of trying at the boundaries of scientific creation, of technology. And it's that core of innovation, of creativity, of the common themes we see in very modern science fiction, of morality, of creating other life forms. It's all of that, but kind of put under, like, wrapped up in the skin of very East Asian aesthetics and history. So to me, I think Gujian 2 really rings true as a story that embodies the essence of silk punk.
Right. Well said. That's I'm glad that we managed to bring in sci-fi, because I think the first time I saw the name Emily Jin, it was in relation to Chinese sci-fi. I think I've read some of your translations up on Clark's World. So I'm glad that we got to, well, I guess we're not really squeezing it in if it's already there in Gujian too, but I'm glad we managed to touch on some sci-fi there.
I know, it's whenever I go, the conversation always becomes about sci-fi. It just happens.
You mentioned before that there was AI or some stuff relating to AI in Gujian too.
Mm-hmm.
And now I know what it is, that someone was building kind of like a silkpunk robot. And you've reminded me, it's kind of a self-indulgent holiday story, but when I was visiting Japan from China, I'd gone on a trip up to Dongbei, then Korea, then into Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I found out about this through just TripAdvisor or Travel Wiki or something. But in Osaka, in the Osaka Science Museum, I think it's a replica. I don't think it's the original, but there's this I don't know what you'd call it, thing called Gaku Tensoku. Sorry for anyone who speaks good Japanese who just heard me slaughter this creature's name, but it's an automaton. I think it was built in the 1900s. 1929. So he's kind of just slightly predates the robot in the film Metropolis by Fritz Lang, but it's like kind of like a silk punk. Do you know the film Metropolis? Have you seen that, or can you picture the robot from that?
Not, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, well, if any listeners have seen the film Metropolis, it's like totally like that. It's like a silk punk version of a jazz age robot, but he's got a great big pen, and I don't know. It kind of has to be seen to be understood, but I think it was doesn't really do that much. But I think when the original was made, it was able to animate, like its arms could move, it could move its pen, its eyes could move. But yeah, that was what popped into my head when you described like a silk punk automaton, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for listeners. There was something else, I think. When you know you were going to mention something, but you don't remember what it was. That's where I am right now. Oh yeah, another way to look at silk punk, if I can remember Ken Leo's definition, I think he compared it to steampunk. So I think steampunk came before cyberpunk, but the idea of steampunk is authors took the steam age of technology. So I guess not everything steam powered, but so steam train engines, zeppelins, the kind of Victorian era engineering of that time, which was futuristic in its time, and they've carried it forward. So they've kind of frozen certain aspects of technological development and then carried it forward. So like I guess an example of that made it into like mainstream or even literary culture is His Dark Materials books, which have a world which is kind of Victorian, but their technology has accelerated in some ways, but in other ways it's frozen. So they have an air travel system that the Victorians didn't, but it's Zeppelin based. And that wasn't really Philip Pullman's original idea. That's taken from steampunk. So if I am understanding right, in like Ken Leo's books, maybe he's using it for different reasons, like you described, but he's taken Chinese engineering and he's kind of powered it up so it can do amazing things. And I'm saying this without having read the books.
Right. I think that's a pretty accurate way of describing his amazing attempts in his books, is that I think like the reason I find it so entertaining is that he would start from very simple materials without involving at all what we kind of see nowadays, like programming or data chips or whatsoever, but he nonetheless still uses the essence of like modern science logic, but that kind of like basing that on very simple materials that are only available in the kind of quote unquote frozen time period. And you kind of like see how that's there and how it's kind of leveling up. And eventually it reaches the realm of not just kind of like simple engineering of making a machine or making like a car or making like an aircraft, but essentially it gets into the whole realm of like, let's say like artificial intelligence. And you see that happening. And it's just a joy in its own to see how him or other silkpunk writers describe the process of leveling up even. You're kind of just there witnessing their creativity in describing how those materials following that logic could possibly be combined together to make what we see today as very advanced kind of modern cutting edge technology. So I guess that's the fun part, the fun part of the science of Silkpunk. And that's also exactly what happens in Gujian 2 is that the protagonist, his entire storyline, that versus the making of kind of like the automaton is kind of like the core of Gujian 2's like Silkpunk feeling is that we have essentially like we have this nerd figure who is obsessed with engineering and is obsessed with how could he like combine more materials into making more advanced technology. So you usually see that kind of usually kind of see that figure in, let's say, like a lot of like classic science fiction. You always get kind of the mad scientist, you get that like trope, like you get like the protagonist of science fiction is often the person who's like making all these horrible machines and technology, and you rarely get the same kind of people appear in a story that's set in ancient China. But who does that? So to me, it especially feels just nice and familiar is that I think it does a great job in combining two of my favorite things together, that you both have the kind of traditional Wuxia narrative, you have the world that's filled with history and mythology of China, that plus a character or a kind of like narrative core that embodies the essence of really fun science fiction, where people actually care about how technology is made. And it's even more fun to see it limited to that historical period.
And this isn't anything specific to China. I'm sure this applies to just the mad scientists of world history. But I think I find cool about the punk part of Silkpunk, steampunk, is that these kind of things have existed in the real world. I can think of a few examples myself where someone has dreamed up a technology or made an early form of a technology which didn't take off until far later in the future. So I guess the most famous example is all the various machines Leonardo da Vinci dreamed up. I mean, I don't know how many of those are falsely attributed and how many are real, but like when you look into that, it's crazy just how many things he kind of predicted, or like I know one of them was the tank, and if you read War of the Worlds, an H.G. Wells sci-fi book, that the machines the aliens travel in, things that move faster and beat artillery, they in a way were tanks, and one of the weapons they have at their disposal is a gas that like poisons people basically. So okay, this is a bit of a horrible dark example, but I guess those are an example from real life, an example from fiction of predictions of where military technology was going to go. Or I had another example. Oh yeah, this is a bit more of a benign one. And this relates to I guess technically a character from Chinese sci-fi, Alan Turing. I say he's from Chinese sci-fi because he's in Xiajia's story, Goodnight Melancholy. Sorry if I threw you off there for a second. But when you start to read about Alan Turing and how he and his colleagues, how early they theorized computers, or how long, well, maybe not hundreds of years, but like quite a long time before him, other logicians and mathematicians were theorizing a thinking machine. It's got to be like food for amazing sci-fi, or even if it's not food for fiction, it's just excellent food for thought, because I guess it's an indication, maybe what Ken Leo's saying is that embedded in like some of the very inspired early Chinese engineering were lots of ideas that weren't able to be realized in reality for practical reason A, B, and C, but they're kind of already there in some kind of potential imagined form. And I guess this is more of a just a thing I wanted to say in the question, but the mind boggles the more you think about it, that, very smart people in ancient times, they maybe didn't have the tools we have now, but in their heads, they may have been grappling with like completely in an abstract form, things that were going to come into reality long after they'd passed away.
Right, exactly. Right. That's also something that I'm currently just very into, I guess both as a personal interest and also academically, of how basically people from different eras carried out their future imagination. And it doesn't always come in the form of concretizing something into reality, such as like you said just now, making machines, let's say all the way back in Tang China or whatsoever. But I think it happens in many different spheres of life, such as there's all kinds of philosophy, there's all kinds of mysticism, there's all kinds of just ways in which you think and imagine, and not just the actual tech, but also the underlying logic behind that. So even just taking the example of making automatons, I think that concept has existed for thousands of years, and people dreamed of it in so many different ways. And I guess our language, our common way of thinking of that is, oh, robots or artificial intelligence. But the way that people have conceptualized that in the past, they may have been getting at the same idea, and yet through a different set of vocabulary or recognition. And I think just opening up this discussion to Silkpunk, to what we've been talking all about just now, I think the underlying attraction of Silkpunk as a genre is that it embodies that core, that essence of future thinking, of imagining some very advanced technology, of, well, and also just imagining what it would be like for those complex imaginations of the future to come true. And yet with that underlying kind of like universal and timeless imagination, you put all of that under a very specific kind of aesthetic setting. And it's kind of like you set a constraint for yourself that, yes, I want to realize this ultimate future imagination, but I can only do so through using whatever's available in this, say, time period / culture at hand. So this is what makes the punk more punk even. I think it makes it challenging, it makes it fun, and it makes it even more creative.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of people ahead of their times, and this is jumping the gun on giving you a slot for self-promo. I know that you recently brought from English into Chinese, I think it's a biography of Philip K. Dick. And I remember you told me you're a big fan of PKD, and it seems like in a lot of the podcasts I listen to, a lot of people want to talk about him, possibly because we're living in very weird times, Dickian times, you might say. Do you think do you think he was ahead of his time, and in what ways? If yes, if no, then whatever.
Certainly. I think when I first started reading him, I think his literature just hit me as something that's very uncanny, I would say, that I wouldn't really classify him as your typical science fiction writer, because I think he's in essence not someone who, like, let's say, dreams about rockets and spaceships and colonizing Mars. Like, those elements happen in a story, I think mostly there for the shock value. But in essence, I think he sees himself, and I see him, as a future thinker. So I think he really is conjuring up different versions of often really horrible futures, and to some extent he's putting himself into the role of this prophet, even, of speaking of it, of imagining it, of bringing those abstract kind of hellish imaginations into reality by putting them down on paper. And I think the reason why people now are just reading him and worshiping him is because they're starting to realize that a lot of his visions, a lot of the worst possible nightmares he's conjured up in his own writing, are gradually kind of happening in our reality. And I think if we go beyond Philip K. Dick and just looking at science fiction in general, one trend that I'm witnessing, especially in the current Chinese science fiction world, is that science fiction and reality are gradually becoming more and more merged together. And I'm sure that you've also heard this idea a lot in your interviews with other people, but even just in Waste Time.
Gentile fan likes to talk about that.
I know he's like all about the science fiction reality, science fiction realism, but I do see that as a growing, and well, it's getting stronger, the trend in China, that people are so unsure about the future, people are so anxious about it. And even just as of now, I'm sitting here in my home, like, I don't know if I can continue my studies in the US, like, I don't know what's going to happen with the world. I'm just kind of waiting it out. And every day comes a new future. And this sense of uncertainty, this sense of being thrown into the cracks, just as a normal person, I also panic about what is there to come. And I think this is why we just turn to science fiction that embraces reality, because through looking at the visions of those writers, like literally from Philip K. Dick to Stanley Chan, were looking at the world through their eyes and learning of all the potentially possible, that's like a grammar mistake, but you get what I mean, like looking at all the possible futures to come that our heads can't possibly imagine all at once. So I think ultimately right now we read science fiction because we want to have a grasp on the future.
Yeah, I think the phrase potentially possible, just it underlines just how ambiguous and up in the air everything is.
I know, it's just double ambiguity.
Yeah. God knows when I'll finish it, but I've been reading bits and bobs of his exegesis, the possibly enlightened, possibly crazy thing he was writing for himself, kind of like a diary. And he was, I mean, who knows how seriously he was taking it, but the big idea of that, if I understand correctly, is that he thinks at some point, well, there's lots of conflicting ideas, but the idea that attracts me most is that at some point, world history just went down a wrong track, or the world we're living in is somehow false, and maybe through enlightenment there's some ways to, if not escape, catch glimpses of the better world that we should or could have been in. And honestly, like ever since about 2015-16, I've heard people playing with the idea that we're in the wrong timeline, something went wrong. And like for me, I was sitting in, I think I first got this feeling sitting in China, where because of the time differences, I was awake when the results from the British EU referendum were coming in, whereas like most people over in Scotland and England would be asleep. And like almost everyone else, I thought, oh, okay, the status quo is going to prevail here. We're not going to commit such a frightening act of self-harm. And then it happened. The results came in, and now it's happened. The UK's left the European Union. And then fast forward a year or so, and okay, I'm not American, but who's in charge of the United States affects us all. And it was the same thing. Oh, sanity will prevail. And then if you'll pardon me expressing a not very controversial opinion, probably in the podcastosphere, sanity did not prevail, and things have only really got weirder since. And now it's kind of, it's transcended like people's choices through elections. A virus has spread across the world. No one voted for that, and it's happening. And now I'm locked down in the countryside for probably more than half a year. Like, what the hell's going on?
It's insane. Yeah,
it's insane.
I think in my case, when you mentioned what happened in America in 2016, because so the backstory is that was when I was still in college. And Hillary Clinton actually went to my college. So I went to Wellesley College, that's near Boston. So like as a fact, but that day I remember that everyone was just basically waiting for her to win. And then the result came out and we were just like, what is happening? I think that was the first time in my life when I felt like my world just like changed completely. That I guess my sense of what's normal, my sense of what's supposed to happen did not happen. And things just started to get weirder from there. So I can totally like feel you when you're talking about like what happened to UK and the EU, like because me living in America back then, that was what impacted me tremendously. And of course with the virus right now, it's just like, even just thinking how, I guess like you leave your house, you wear a mask, and that has become such normalcy. And when you look back, like this has not even been for a full year yet.
And I should probably say for like anyone who's a little skeptical listening and thinking, oh, Angus was just heartbroken because the side he wanted to win some votes lost. Well, that had happened plenty of times before. Like I had voted in the Scottish referendum, I voted for independence, didn't get it. I'm a left-leaning person. The right-wing party has won the British election. They've won like 3 in a row now. That's a little dispiriting, but that doesn't have the same quality of weirdness. Another thing, the only kind of instance where I remember feeling this weirdness before, the great wave of it, circa like the last few years, was when I was in high school. I don't know if you remember this, when the Large Hadron Collider was doing its big test, and there were some articles going around that a hole in the universe might open up and suck us all in. That was, I felt, there was one day where I felt like, whoa, everything I know might not be real. And that was for one day. And now at like a low level, it's every day. So I know we've completely left the plane of Gujian here. and now we're into sci-fi. But yeah, I just don't think it can be stated enough, like how much how much weird and science fiction literature is doing for me right now, thankfully.
Indeed. And it's like, I know, I mean, I turned to science fiction previously for the thrill, and now that my reality has become somewhat more horrifying and quote unquote thrilling than science fiction, I actually turn to sci-fi for comfort. That I think a part of me feels that if writers, if translators, if readers are imagining the worst future, then perhaps in some messed up timeline or world space that we can possibly purge the worst future by speaking of it through science fiction. So that's kind of like my little hope, but clearly I don't think whoever runs America right now reads a lot of science fiction. So I don't think he reads.
No. There are some complaints that are so obvious and so easy to make. I don't bother, but I feel like one upside of being disappointed is that your illusions are shattered, and you can start to look at things in a new light.
Yeah.
I feel like we're getting a bit lost now.
Yeah. No, it's just like this tangent is also very interesting. So I'm just kind of like thinking about it. But,
yeah. We should probably get back to Chinese literature, though. That is what the podcast's about. So yeah, it's probably the right time to get onto lighter questions. This is the miscellaneous section. Do you think you could suggest for the listeners a Chinese word of the day? If you don't have one, I have one kind of in my head. Even if you do have one, I'll still bust out my one if you want to go first.
You can go first. Just go for it.
All right. So this is one I learned today because, well, long story short, I was thinking, okay, what does Gujian mean? I think I had remembered Gu is the character for ancient. Like if you visit a Chinese water town, they're often called a Gujian, ancient town. But Jian, I thought, I know some Jian characters. What's this one? And I checked. And if I've got it right, the Jian in Gujian is a two-sided sword, a Chinese style of sword. I've got that right, haven't I? Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know much about them. I did notice an article I read on them gave as some kind of a parallel the Japanese katana. It said, oh, you know how there's a Japanese sword with a name, the katana? Well, there is a special sword in China too. It's the Jian. And I guess that gets back to my earlier point. If you wrote a sentence in English and it said the man was holding a katana, you'd have a vision of a guy, possibly a Japanese guy, or just a nerd holding this particular kind of sword. Whereas if you wrote in English, I saw a man holding a jian, your average English language reader would be like, what is a jian? Even though it's a perfectly straightforward thing to get your head around it.
Great. Actually, when you say jian, because I also practice wushu, so Chinese martial arts back in college, and we refer to the kind of jian in Gujian as just straight sword. So I think that's the name for it, at least in martial art terms. It's just like a straight sword. It's straight. To kind of draw a difference between that versus kind of like the heavier sense of what you were talking about, the heavier sense of medieval, like double-handed like, slashing thing. So yeah, the jian is meant to be more like slender and more somewhat graceful / elegant. Right. But yeah, if people want to see what a jian looks like, play Gujian and you'll get a lot of them. You upgrade them as you go. So
I remember thinking that when it threw you in with the brother character, this really strong guy. It's like, whoa, his sword looks like a very nice sword. I shouldn't have this yet. And then sure enough, you get sent down to Earth as the main character and he's got a wooden stick. And I was like, okay, this is more like it.
And I'm just like, okay, that's me. It's like I like feel myself resonating a lot with like the younger brother, which is the actual protagonist in the black suit, not the brother, because I'm just kind of like, I'm not used to like being really powerful. I just want to like live my life as a mortal and like fight monkeys and like laugh at rich people, and that's it. But anyways,
in my family on both sides, I'm the oldest brother and the oldest cousin. So
wow.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think initially when it wasn't clear which character you were going to be for the rest of the game, I was like, yeah, this younger brother needs to learn his lesson. And when I meet someone who's I tell them that I'm the oldest cousin or the oldest sibling, and they're like, they've been the youngest one their whole childhood, I can see this look in their eye where they're like, you swine. But yeah, what's your word of the day?
So actually, I was gonna suggest something that also contains the character Jian. So yay. So I guess I was thinking about the core of the Gujian games, and it's actually quite a complex, not like word but phrase I'm gonna talk about. But it's four characters. It's 勤心剑破.
清新剑
So
破.
yep. So that came up first during Gujian first, and I guess that phrase just stayed and became kind of like a promotional phrase that lasted throughout the series. But essentially, so to take it apart character by character, qin is like the traditional kind of music element. I don't even know if there's direct translation for it, but it's basically like a harp but horizontal. It's like a stringed element. A stringed instrument, not element. But I don't even know if there's like a direct translation for it, because in some translations I've seen, they just call it the pinyin, the qin. That's like the first character. The second character is xin, so heart. The third character is jian, so sword, like we said just now. And the fourth character, po, means like the soul. So put together is that you have the heart of said musical instrument and the soul of the sword. And it's used to describe a person's kind of character. And I think that's really interesting because it really embodies the essence of xia, the idea of like heroism, the idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of kind of like improving yourself to become stronger, but at the same time carrying more responsibility to save the world or to cultivate yourself. So I think that's a very visual embodiment of the idea of xia that comes throughout all of the Wuxia and Xianxia, and also the essence of the Gujian games of how basically you should kind of sharpen your soul like a sword to be able to fight all the darkness and all the bad people, but at the same time have a heart that's soft and open and just kind. So I think that's the general vibe I've gotten from these games, and I think it's just like a very nice phrase in general. It just feels very educated.
Yeah, I think like my just drawing from like as a kid, not being a China obsessive, but having seen a little bit of wuxia in films, a thing that stuck with me is the heroes of those films are never thugs, and they often dress quite nicely as well. They're kind of, I'm trying to think like of a good equivalent phrase, maybe something like a warrior poet. Not that every of the characters can do great poetry, but yeah, that they've got a poetic soul, but they could probably beat you up in a fight if they needed to.
Yeah, it's like that kind of degree of mixture of violence and elegance, I would say. So it's that kind of aesthetic. It's like a lot of wuxia swag. So
right. Lends itself well to those Final Fantasy hairstyles. Yeah. Who's your favorite character from any Gujian game? I'm wondering if it might be the protagonist from the first one. If that's not too hard. Yeah.
It's like I love him as like a character, and I also love his nemesis. So them as like, I guess, a pair of people who mirror each other, and also as this couple I ship secretly. So I love them.
What are their names?
So they all have like really long forward names. Sorry, 4 character names, but the protagonist is Baili Tu, and the nemesis is Ouyang Shaogong.
Ouyang Shaogong. Okay.
Yep. So it's like very complex names, and I think it's like probably a pain in the ass to translate their names into English because it just takes up like a very long line in general.
Right.
But yeah, so I know that Gujian 1 is like not translated. I know the graphics aren't great, but it just holds a very special place in my heart, as I've re-emphasized.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I only watched like 10 odd minutes of the gameplay. And I think, like I said earlier, I could see there was like a labor of love. And if technical proficiency was lacking, you could get the sense that if they made another game, provided the time and the money, they were going to get better because the effort was already there. And then sure enough, they did. Whereas like Fable, that game was cracking from the start, and then the second game was like a little bit, it had some flab to it. The story wasn't as tight. The graphics didn't look as sharp, even if it looked more expensive. And then the third one, everything I heard was like, God, I just never want to play that. It's like, I don't know, a string on an instrument goes from being nicely tuned to almost falling off the instrument because they already had it nailed from the start. So the effort wasn't there. Damn, I'm really not getting to the point, am I? Right.
That's
So we've
totally.
had question I left out. So sorry if I throw you off here, but I think it's too fun to leave out in the show.
Mhm.
I've asked not listeners. I've asked guests in the last few episodes if the story we were discussing was a drink, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, what would it be?
Oh,
Do you
oh
think
my God,
Gujian could be a beverage?
definitely. Wait, that's an amazing question. I hope I had prepared for it because I'm like also very into alcoholic beverages.
Mm,
So right now I'm just kind of like I want to answer this question really well.
okay.
I don't know because I also see the three games as three different entities.
Right.
Um, so it's very hard to kind of pick out a common liquor for like all of them.
Mm,
Uh, but I don't know. I think I see Gujian first, like the first game at least, as a kind of like strong, smoky classic whiskey.
right.
That's kind of how I would see it. The second one is more like a like kind of I don't know, like a light-hearted cocktail that contains like a certain sweet sense.
Mm,
I can't think of one right now, but that's kind of the vibe I'm thinking of.
right.
And I think in three is kind of like a little bit of everything that is more kind of like, yeah,
I
that's my
can't.
answer for now. Yeah.
Fair
What are you
enough.
thinking?
This is a stupid answer. Green tea.
Oh.
Thanks for giving us a different flavor of booze for all three games. Much appreciated.
Oh wait,
Now,
I realized. I
oh,
think I'm gonna call Gujian 3 like a classic like salty dog cocktail. That's what I think it is. It's
okay,
like salty. So yeah.
excellent. We've done a wee bit of promo for you, talking about the Philip K. Dick translation you did. Although I don't think we said which book was it that you brought into Chinese.
So the English version is called I think Searching for Philip K. Dick, written
Mm,
by Annie R. Dick, which is his third wife, I think.
right.
Yeah. So it's the only biography of PKD that's written by someone who's like in his family, and it's just very close to heart in general. It describes a lot of his personal details and what it's like to interact with him in person. And she went to interview like his other family members and his old friends in Berkeley. So I think it's unique in the sense that it's very personal as a biography. It talks less about his achievements as kind of like, oh, one of the great literary heroes of the past century, but more kind of like what he is like as a person. And I think it deals a lot with theory of mind, of trying to understand him, trying to understand where his inspirations came from. And it's just so kind of deeply emotional and personal. So
Mm,
it's a very touching biography in general. And it's just a great read on its own as well, even if you're not necessarily into PKD.
cool. And giving you a little bit more scope for some self promo here. Where can listeners find you and your work online? And where can they read, or even, if possible, buy your translations? Where can we send them?
So for English into Chinese, like we said before, my most recent translated book is the PKD biography. So you can just buy it in Chinese. For Chinese into English, most of my translation works are like published in Clarkesworld, I would say. So I did do a lot of work for Clarkesworld, and they're all just online. So you can just like look up different stories I've done. And to find me, you can just look at my Twitter. Basically, I check once in a while. I don't necessarily always talk and tweet, but I do check it. So I think Twitter is like a good place to find me.
And that's at Emily Jin. Is that right?
Yes.
Excellent. Another kind of promo question, but this time not a self promo. If listeners want to check out more, well, if they want to play Gujian 3, they can get it off Steam. If you were giving them a more general like direction for some Wuxia or Xianxia to check out, is there anywhere close to your heart that you would send them?
I think it goes both ways. For people who read Chinese, there's actually one book I want to recommend. The title in Chinese is called 西语言修仙. So, which literally it's about someone who's in a Xianxia system, but the protagonist, he's actually like a software engineer, and he upgrades himself by making more complex like softwares and learning more programming languages. So it's like a really cool way to write Xianxia in general. So if you read Chinese, that's online, you can just look it up. It's a great web novel. And for English readers, I know that, do you go on Wuxia World?
That's the last 2 episodes I've done have been about Wuxia World novels, Necropolis Immortal, and well, one which is on Wuxia World but was originally in print, Seven Killers by Gulong. So I've not read a whole novel on there, but I've been looking at it recently on the show, and our listeners who've been tuning into the Wuxia season will know about Wuxia World.
Right. So yeah, I think that's the place you can just look at, just dive in, find your favorite. And I know that there are amazing translators working for Wuxia World, who's just been bringing a lot of great web novels from Chinese into English as well. So that's like definitely a treasure cave to dig into.
Yeah, and like, so it's been a new world for me, and although some of what I've seen on there is perhaps not my cup of tea, just from the perspective of like, I don't know, literary diversity or following, like I don't know, I'm a very curious, nosy person. I love exploring both physical places and just like weird nooks and crannies. And like the literature you can read on Wuxia World, especially the Xianxia, I don't think there's anything else like it. It's very unique. And if you guys are intrigued by like anyone who's not read any Xianxia and is intrigued by all the talk of it being some kind of a relative of video games, yeah, from that perspective, it's fascinating and it's unique. So yeah.
It's also like very addictive, to be frank. Like sometimes when I'm just kind of like before bed, I read a few chapters, and it often turns into like I read till like 6 a.m. It's not even that the story is like great, but it's just somehow like very addictive. So that's why I keep on saying that I think those stories give you the same thrill as you playing a game. So
right,
it's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And last question of all, this is usually where I ask my guests, what are you reading just now? But I'm also going to ask you, what have you been reading, but what have you been playing, if anything?
So game-wise, I've just been I'm still pretty obsessed with Animal Crossing on Switch. So that's what I've been playing just now. I think it's like a very soothing way to get through your days, especially in this sad time. And with reading, so I'm not reading, it's not science fiction, it's more kind of like, unfortunately, it's like boring academic stuff, but this book is pretty cool. It's called The Neg Anthropocene by Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, and translated by Daniel Ross into English, from French into English. And in this book, basically, Stiegler, as a philosopher, kind of talks about the current sad world we're living in, and talks about the climate, talks about politics, and talks about basically how the human future is getting gradually kind of more bleak and hopeless. So it's a very, it's a very like our time kind of philosophy book to read, but it's also quite academic and quite heavy. So it's kind of part for my my like research. But if anyone's interested and want to read sad philosophy, feel free to dive in.
It's not too coincidental because those are the times we live in. But as I've been doing my work, which as of this week has been typesetting, so it's the kind of work I can do whilst listening to something in my ears. So I've been listening to the lectures of Mark Fisher, who what is he concerned with? It's capitalist realism. So the idea that the economic system we live in, not his idea isn't that it will never go away, but he's talking about how the idea that it can't be changed is so embedded and how it's going nowhere good. And he passed away not so long ago. But again, we were talking about people who are being proven correct by history, and it seems like he's one of them. So I haven't been reading him, but I can, when you say you're reading sad things about the state of the world, I'm sure you're not alone. That was a nice long chat. I think this is probably the longest chat I've had since we had Ken Leo on to talk about Vagabonds. So yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah, well, I'm just amazed we talking about a video game took us to so many places. I didn't really see that coming.
Oh, I know. I think we just, talking was also fun, so we just kind of were doing it.
That's what it is, yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, Emily. And yeah, you're welcome back anytime. Not the next episode, that would be a bit strange, but it would be great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really enjoyable, and I also was able to kind of bounce off a lot more ideas from you, and that was just great. Talk about Gujian and not just about science fiction. It's like very refreshing.
Right. Well, it's the magic of podcasts, I guess. Well, we're almost at the end of the show. Thanks again to Emily Jin for coming on and having such a wide-ranging conversation. So just the plugs left now. So here's something I've not pushed for quite a wee while, but I'd like to put more emphasis on this. Listeners, if you would like to do something helpful for the show, please leave a review and a rating on your podcast provider for the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. iTunes is, it's probably the best one, but like Google Podcasts as well, if you can leave a positive review or 5-star rating on there, that would help me boost the show, in the magical internet algorithms and help more people find the show. So yeah, that would be a fantastic way you can support the show. If you'd like access to all of the different bonus shows I put up on Patreon, just go to patreon.com/churchoffic. I'd be eternally grateful, obviously. If you'd like to contribute to the show, but not with a monthly donation, just with a one-off one, because, seems pretty reasonable, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/churchoffic. Links for both of those will be in the show notes up on Podbean. Of course, the most amazing thing you can do for the show is spreading the word. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your nemesis if you don't fall in love with them first, in the fanfic version, of course. And with that mental image lingering in your head, I'll say 再见.